4, 3, 2, and we're going to just let people hop on, and we'll be live in 1. All right, folks, feel free to comment and ask questions in the Q&A. Welcome to Unblocked Live. I'll give everybody a second to hop on before I announce our guest today, who I'm very excited to talk to because he has been everywhere that I have not been. He has been there, and I'm going to announce him in a quick second and give people a chance to jump on. And excited. All right. Adam says he's excited to be here. Thanks, Adam. I appreciate it. We're excited to get all of these comments. Keep them coming. Keep them coming because we know you have a lot of questions. We have a lot of answers, especially Brendan, because he's been in, I would have to say, every single activated city. And after the intro, you can correct me if that characterization is wrong, but I think you've been in almost every single. Take a second to think about it. You've been so many places. I'd be surprised to know how many days you actually spent in the last year in your actual residence. And with that, our guest today is Brendan Gutenschwager. Welcome to Unblocked Live, Mondays and Wednesdays at noon Pacific. This is the Anti-Polarization podcast. I am your host, Jeremy Lee Quinn. As I said, our guest today is Brendan Gutenschwager, an independent from the upper upper Midwest, I guess you could call it, who has been an independent photojournalist, and he's been everywhere. Welcome, Brendan, to Unblocked Live. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
And just answer the question, have you even been at home very much of the last 8 months?
Very little. Very, very little.
You're everywhere. You were just in Tampa even.
It was just in Tampa. Prior to that was DC. Prior to that had been Rochester, New York. It's hard to keep track of it all, honestly. And I was thinking about your question on the have I been everywhere? I think the only major cities I have not hit that probably had some major protest activity would be the ones in Texas, like Austin, Dallas. Those are like the only ones that I was thinking back. I'm like, I have like in previous years, but not in the last year with like the 2020 protests or anything like that.
Did you go to Denver? Were you in Denver?
Denver, I did briefly, yeah, back in July, but it wasn't very much. Like the day that I went there wasn't one of their like bigger protest days. So I wouldn't really consider myself having covered Denver either, just knowing that there have been bigger demonstrations there at other times.
I was going to say probably Austin. Some of those Texas actions were, I guess, a little off the beaten path, but we know we've seen your video from Kenosha. We've seen your video from the Pacific Northwest, and you've had some run-ins yourself, and we'll get into that as far as what it means to be out there and to be in the midst of it all, especially when you have so many other people who are professing to be independent press that are part of these actions. It certainly gets harder to sort of identify yourself as press. And I know you're going to have some stories about that. I've seen video of you in Wisconsin as well. So we'll get to all that, but let's get into the Capitol first, because that's what's on everybody's mind. I know the impeachment's going on. It's being discussed. You were on the west side, I think the same side I was. You were a little further ahead of me because I've seen the video. Take us back to, first of all, what I've said, and you can either agree or disagree, is that I wasn't expecting anything during the day. I was saving my energy for night. On January the 6th, you wake up in Washington, D.C. What is your state of mind? Where do you go first?
Yeah, so I actually had similar thoughts on that. It's interesting, you having covered some of these previous events had that same inclination of probably more at night things might happen. And then unexpectedly, like it was much, much earlier in the day. So yeah, for the 6th, my day had started. Once again, barely got any sleep because actually the night before they had already been out marching. There were some clashes with police there in BLM Plaza. And so, yeah, I didn't get to bed till late at night, started early in the morning. Started out just kind of walking around the area near the White House, near the ellipse, trying to get any imagery of like them boarding up still, because some places were still doing that. and then making my way over towards where the crowds were gathered to get in for the president's speech. Of course, by that point, there were already people packed in because people had lined up starting at like midnight. And so there was no getting into the ellipse itself. I pretty much just stuck to the area in the street there on Constitution Avenue or across there at the National Mall, all that area outside the Washington Monument where people had been gathering for like the sort of excess crowd, anybody that wasn't able to get into the ellipse, and just kind of covering things from there.
Well, a couple quick questions. Did you ever see any guns on January the 6th?
Only ones that were with like the police or the National Guard. Actually, even the National Guard, I don't think had the guns by that point, not the morning of the 6th. So really just police. And that's one thing I was looking for to see, like, given that a lot of these protest groups in other capitals, if they had been in Michigan or Ohio, places like that, were willing to bring open firearms. But I didn't see any there. Tactical gear, yes, like the bulletproof looking vests, not even like the full-on ones that I saw in some of these other cities, but just some of those things, or like the zip tie handcuffs, some of the more like smaller tactical gear type stuff, but not open firearms.
So you did witness the zip tie, and did you see that?
I think very briefly at one point, just kind of in the melee outside. I saw I don't know if it was the dude in the infamous photo that was like propelling on the wall inside of the House chamber. It might have actually just been somebody else that had some, but yeah, just to briefly.
Interesting. It is curious that armed insurrection trended on Twitter, and there are still a couple publications that have used the term armed insurrection in their description of January the 6th. But myself, I did not see any firearms. Two other reporters who I've interviewed, Richie McGinnis and Ford Fisher, both said they did not see firearms. So it's a very interesting point. I've told my audience this before, there were only 3 arrests in the Capitol grounds for carrying without a license. Now, I noticed that you shot that sign. There were flyers that they would post back in November, also at the Million MAGA March 1, which was November the 14th, also December the 12th, the Million MAGA March 2. I saw those same flyers. You took a picture of it. They were flyers that basically told people, educated them that you can't carry in DC, correct?
Yeah, and it seemed that even some of the organizers of the groups also made it a point to make those announcements ahead of time. Hey, this is not like the Oregon State Capitol protests or the Michigan State Capitol. Don't bring firearms. This is not like a Second Amendment rally. So it seemed like there was some messaging ahead of time, like don't bring your firearms to DC because it's generally speaking not legal for the majority of the population.
Right. And I did see those. It was Metropolitan Police Department that did have flyers posted to people who were coming into town to know that you cannot carry a firearm in Washington, D.C.
I have an interesting point on that, something that I witnessed. Don't know if this had anything to do with the firearms, but it's something that I did see, and I just thought it was odd. There was a whole slew of vehicles, a lot of pickup trucks parked on some of those bridges going in and out of D.C. right at the Virginia border. Like right at the border. And it was unusual because it was like a street that up and down you could have parked anywhere, but these people specifically parked right where the state border was and then going into Virginia, even though all the parking that would have been closer to DC because it was still in DC along this road, all that was still open. So that was an unusual thing. I hypothesized could have something to do with the firearms, could be totally unrelated. I just thought it was odd that people parking, and some of them had like stickers that seemed like it was people that were going to the event, that they would park that far away, specifically right across the border into Virginia, and then I assume just walk the rest of the way into DC.
Huh. Yeah. That is interesting. Now, there were 6 arrests total for firearms that were reported. As I said, 3 on the Capitol grounds. It's not clear if any of those 3 were actually inside the Capitol. 3 other were 1 to 2 miles away from the Capitol, but sort of got filed in all together. And I should check for an update on that very soon. But let's get right into the Capitol. So at what time do you arrive on the west side of the Capitol? Is the president's speech still going on, or do you wait for the president's speech to end?
Basically, I had stayed for the bulk of the president's speech and then wanted to leave at least a few minutes before what I figured would be the end. You don't know for sure when he'll stop speaking, but wanted to get a little bit of a head start before the masses of people all made their way over there. So I would say I was there just about 1 o'clock. So the speech was still going on. He was still giving the remarks, I believe, until 1:12 was the timestamp on like when he ended. And you can fact check me if that's incorrect, but I believe I had seen 1:12 as the number. And then, yeah, so I made my way over just about 1 o'clock, and already, people were clashing, pushing into the barricades, trying to get closer and closer to the Capitol building, pushing back against police, that sort of thing.
Well, I looked at the timestamps, and there's a montage that was put together, and I think it was the New York Times, and Elijah Schaefer of The Blaze. His video features very prominently because he seemed to be one of the first people that was there at 12:53 p.m. while the president is still speaking. People begin to amass at the first barricade. Now, for folks who haven't heard me describe this, I describe it as 2 to 3 football fields in length to get from the edge of the lawn, where the street meets the lawn, where there's a fountain in front of the Capitol, to get all the way to the front. It's 2 or 3 football fields from what I measured using Apple Maps. Now, for you to leave the ellipse and the big crowd early, it's almost that thing of if you're at a baseball game and you leave early to get out ahead because you don't want to get stuck in the crowd. What I don't know if people realize this, but this was tens of thousands of people. I describe it as an arena-sized crowd, like if you're at a music festival or you're at a ball game or something like that, where you have tens of thousands of people. So you got there, it sounds like at least an hour before I did, because I was still in my hotel or motel watching the president's speech, because I was trying to conserve energy. I thought I had to go till 1 or 2 a.m. because in December and in November, that's where the action took place, which was after dark, when you had these melees between the Black Bloc Antifa practitioners and Proud Boys and others that were of the militant sort of street battles that would go on. So I was trying to conserve energy. You get there. As I said, 12:53. What happens? Just to set up your story, it takes 30 seconds for those first folks arriving to start shaking the metal barricades. There's about a dozen Capitol Police that are up front. It takes 90 seconds for them to break through that first dozen Capitol Police and essentially push further towards the Capitol. They go past the lawn areas to the steps, what I would call the lower terrace of the Capitol. And I think that's where I see a lot of your first video being shot. Can you tell me about the first video of when you noticed this is a melee, this is going to be activated?
Yeah, so as I was approaching, I had noticed some barricades that were pushed to the side. As I got closer, saw actually some people actively taking down some of the sort of construction looking fencing. It was that like malleable, like plastic sort of orange fencing that was used. People were taking that down and just trying to make their way closer up to the main terrace of the Capitol, like you said. And pretty much right when I got there, they were already clashing, which of course makes sense now in retrospect, because they were pushing just to even get to that point. I kind of walked up, saw these barricades to the side, and was like, oh, okay, kind of unusual that there would be barricades here, but they're pushed to the side. Then as I got closer, saw some of the other barricades still actively being pushed aside or taken down, then it all made sense. And then, yeah, once I got up close to where they held that main line for quite a while, for about an hour, they held that line right outside of the terrace, trying to prevent people from going up the steps and actually like to the doors of the building. And, that was just truly, truly chaotic. And it's not that I haven't seen clashes with police before. Obviously, there have been plenty of those, but it's really unusual to see the amount of fighting back that I saw there. Because I've seen, the Portland, those marches, they'll throw fireworks at police, they'll set a fire down the street to kind of like throw them off and then, march in one other direction. There'll be things like that. This was people at times picking up the barricades, throwing them at police, grabbing their own pepper spray or mace and, spraying that onto the police. And then likewise, police spraying people back. Within minutes, I saw tear gas, flashbangs, things of that nature, all that before the Capitol breach. That was going on, in that 1 to 2 p.m. hour when they were just still kind of battling back and forth between the police and just the crowds that were growing and growing by the minute, because as the speech ended, people then made their way down, people that were filing out of the ellipse and making their way to the Capitol building. So literally like minute by minute from the moment I arrived all the way up through probably the 3 o'clock hour, you just saw the crowd growing and growing, going further and further back onto that lawn that you described, a couple of football fields in length, just going all the way back there.
And one viewer asks right here, did BG see any weapons? That we talked about guns, but did you see, what kind of weapons did you see? And if so, were they pedestrian grade weapons, or what did you see?
Well, I guess it would be dependent on the definition of that pedestrian grade weapon, but like I saw baseball bats, I saw, like I said, the pepper spray mace. You could definitely consider that a weapon if you spray it at somebody. Trying to think if there were any other major.
One of your videos, which is at the sort of center vomitorium archway where people are getting sprayed and stuff, shows somebody with a skateboard.
Yeah. And then later on, obviously not right from the get-go, but once they were able to get some of those riot shields from the police, those would later be used as weapons then. Other than that, I'm trying to think if there were any other major like standout weapons. Not really, because did not see firearms there. Definitely saw people in more of the militant style garb or outfits, but not openly carrying. And that would be probably the extent of that. I would say like the baseball bats and poles. A couple people like picked up poles, things like that. It didn't look like things that they brought in, but definitely picked that up and brought it closer to the Capitol once it was the clashing with police there.
So there are some terms that I have for this that I've picked up in studying what are called insurrectionary anarchist tactics, basically. And autonomous organizing is a principle that was hailed by anarchist publications back in May in Minneapolis, that autonomous organizing, when people come together in an opportunistic event, it's not necessarily planned as much as it is improvised, and that certain groups are willing to go as far as a revolt, but may have not known that when they woke up in the morning, quite simply, that it would get that height. And I think certainly for us reporters, we thought everything was going to happen at night. Certainly there might have been indication that law enforcement also, based on what they had seen in December and in November, had seen peaceful protests during the day from this crowd. This is an interesting question here. Were the first breachers different than normal MAGA people that you saw all year? Eric asks.
It was a mix. So there were a few that seemed more militant than the average Trump supporter in terms of like kind of chanting like go, 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 trying to get people in, trying to get people hyped up. And they themselves in like full on, face coverings in black and just, or camo for some of them. Sort of that more militant look, not really typical of most Trump rallies. And then you also had a mix of total regular looking Trump rally goers, people that are just, waving their flags on the lawn, things like that. So it was a real mix. It was, you had those sort of militant, like look people that were more ready for that type of action, and other people that were like, oh, this is what's going on, and just kind of like stormed in with them, it seemed.
The first two people I interviewed, because I was coming up in the 2 p.m. hour, and I went to the top of the scaffolding on the west side, and I couldn't get any further. So I came back down and decided to do a live shot back near the fountain where I could get reception. The two first people I spoke to were called praying grandmas. That's what their protest, I guess, Facebook or whatever their identification was. They were called praying grandmas, and they were grandmas who were very proud of the fact that they had just walked into the Capitol and even said, this is our house. This is, that you heard that refrain a lot, that this is our house. And that I think goes back to the Salem, Oregon protests at the end of December and the beginning of January. You had people saying all legislative sessions should be open. That seemed to be a right-wing protest talking point, which is, this is our house. We should be allowed to go in and see these sessions as they belong to the people. So anyways, on publicreport.org/capital, there's a capital page, and I have several interviews that I did that day, praying grandmas. When I was shooting the video of now the infamous bullhorn lady, there was another grandma that was in that crowd. It was very diverse. I want to get your reaction to this statistic from the Atlantic. They published a report from something called, out of University of Chicago, called Chicago Project on Safety. They analyzed 193 arrestees. Of those 193 arrested, that makes up about a fourth. There were roughly 800 that actually went into the Capitol, they said, in this Atlantic piece. Only 1 out of 10 had any sort of affiliation when it came to a group, such as 3%er militia, Oath Keepers, or Proud Boys. Only 1 in 10, which leaves 9 out of 10 sort of part of this populist crowd that we are describing. What's your reaction to that?
I would say statistics are probably a little low, because I would imagine there's a few that may have been part of a group that just like weren't going to mention that when confronted about it. But by and large, I think that that's accurate, that you just saw a lot of people that were sort of individuals or small groups, like families or whatnot. A lot of them left kids at home, but just like groups of adults that traveled on these like bus trips that were organized. I know there was one organized out of Michigan, one out of Tennessee. And yeah, it was like more of just like this hodgepodge of general Trump supporters from all over, not necessarily, the 3%ers of Oregon are going to send this group and everybody, and that's exclusively going to be who ends up in the Capitol. Nothing like that. It was more of just this, this potpourri of a lot of people and a lot of different affiliations, or just no affiliations, like you said, the people that were just like there.
Yeah. And the way I characterize it is a difference between Facebook protesters and 4chan, or Facebook activists and 4chan types, you know what I mean? And those 4chan types, which everybody seems to be using the label of white supremacy to characterize them. I actually did meet one on January the 7th. He was a fellow who characterized himself as an extremist. It's on my website, publicreport.org. I live streamed and interviewed him, and he said he was an extremist, and he said that he studied hundreds of hours of black bloc tactics of Antifa groups. And he confessed to leading the agitation on the east side over opposite us, where the media pen was, because all that stuff with the media, I don't think you or I saw.
No,
because it was on the east side where the media pen got attacked.
Which makes sense, because I wondered initially when I saw those videos, like, where was that media tent even set up? Because it wasn't over there on the west side. But then later was able to pin that down. Okay, so over on that side. It
was on the east side. And the guy who was still in this like black ops gear, you'll see it on publicreport.org if anybody, it's the first thing now up, that interview with him. He said Antifa and BLM showed us that violence worked. Was the soundbite that he said to me, and he was very unapologetic about. Now it would be interesting to try to interview somebody like that again, but given the climate that we are in right now. But it was the day after, and he returned to quote unquote the scene of the crime. It's a very interesting interview. But wow. But I found those types to be few and far between. Now, one person appears in your video here. We'll see if you may or may not know this. I just want to play. This is when you first get into the rotunda, perhaps. It's the clip that I showed you right beforehand. Anything you want to say to set this up? I do notice a lot of Trump hats. That seems to be the unifying theme that holds everything together. But can you tell us a little bit to set this up? When you went into the inside area, I know you have some video of people bashing out. There's one identified Proud Boy who's bashing out a window. How did things progress up to the clip that I'm about to show, where everybody is sort of in tug of war of sorts.
Yeah, so once they had broken in through the window, that was the initial breach. Because prior to that, I didn't see anybody on the interior from any other doors or any other entrances. So they broke into the window. A lot of people just kind of crawled in through there, kind of surged in. Looked very militant style, I'm not gonna lie, just like everybody pouring in there, and you had to like crouch down because it was a small window. And then once they were inside, we were able to open up one of the doors that they had been pounding, trying to open from the outside. We're able to open that from the inside, and then people were able to just kind of walk in then. And the area where that was on the interior, there was like nobody there. It was really unusual, actually. There weren't any police, weren't any lawmakers or staff. It was like an empty portion of the corridor. And so from there, that allowed a whole lot of people to come in because there was literally no resistance. And then kind of just surged through. People went off in different directions because obviously there's a lot of different hallways and, byways and passages in the Capitol building there. So whatever, it was kind of just at random. It was like follow pretty much like the largest set of people wherever they go. I wasn't going to follow like individual 2 people that went off into some room or things like that. And so I stuck with the main large group to see like what they did and how that went, which then led to at some point, I don't even know what the name of that specific area is, that like circular room. It wasn't
rotunda,
but that wasn't the rotunda.
Okay.
I don't know if that's underneath the rotunda and that's why the room's circular or what, because like that in and of itself is not the rotunda, but that was where there was a line of police. Really unusual scene because police were just kind of there, almost like they knew that people were going to arrive, but didn't have any major like riot shields or any weapons for pushing back. And they were kind of few and far between too. It wasn't even like a continuous line of police. It was sort of like staggered out. And yeah, people just kind of like poured in. And once it got to the point where the room was packed, people just surged forward and pushed into the police there.
And is that what we're about to see right now? This clip? Okay, let's take a look. So this is the clip that he had just set up.
Real wonder there, even when don't hear it, like it's like as the whole crowd is pushing in, really unusual.
Hey, let me take down the volume. One sec. Oh, sorry about that. What did you say? Because I had the volume up a little high.
Yeah, so a few seconds into it, as they're like starting to push the police forward, you can even hear somebody say, "Don't hurt him," and he was referring to the police officer, like he was telling the other Trump supporters there that were doing this, "Don't hurt the police officer." This is really unusual. Yeah, I think it's like a couple of seconds past this point here if you just listen in.
Okay, that's interesting.
Right there. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, don't hurt him. It was interesting when I left closer to 6 p.m. There was a strange dichotomy. People who were leaving, half of them were still cussing and calling the officers oath breakers. The other half were saying thank you to the officers, which is this strange sort of, surreal moment I found. And I'll want to get your comments at the end of the whole event as well. Now, this is interesting. At the beginning of this clip, did you notice who's here peeping out right by that bullhorn?
After the fact, I did, yes.
Yeah.
It wasn't until a couple weeks later that I saw that portion of the video that I don't know what his name is, but I've just seen many images of him. He was the one that had the Camp Auschwitz. Yeah,
there you see it. You see it right there, just as he peeps out. Yep. He's from Virginia, is my understanding. And it would be, I talked earlier about 4chan types. And when you see someone like that, this is what when you're in a crowd like that, the question is, well, how does somebody who has a sweatshirt that's so obviously racist get away with being in that crowd? And the fact of the matter is that a lot of people aren't looking. You're so distracted by the spectacle that's in front of you, you're not looking at that guy's shirt. So I'm sure I could have missed some extremist symbols, though I was looking really hard for them and I couldn't find them. But any other extremist symbols that you might have seen, or anything that, because that gets so much of the media attention and the portrayal, they cherry pick one person or one character. The same for the Viking guy, that so much media attention goes to these fringe players. And really what we're seeing, and you could see in that clip, all the Trump hats, it's just how populist that crowd was. But just doing our due diligence, were there any extremist symbols that you saw?
I wasn't particularly focused on that in that moment just because of how chaotic it was. Earlier on, I was trying to keep an eye out, but as it got way too chaotic, I was just trying to, one, keep myself safe, because it was getting to the point where like everyone was just getting pushed around in all directions, squeezed in. So none that really stuck out to me. That's one thing that I do want to, at some point when I have some time, go back through and kind of look more detailed in the footage. But there weren't any that like immediately stuck out. I will put the asterisk there that there may be some in my own footage that I've released that I just personally have not taken notice of yet, just because it's been so chaotic. I haven't had time to go through in nitty gritty detail on all of it. But yeah, it definitely was not like a plethora of them to where it stuck out. You know what I mean? It wasn't something where, oh, here came a group of 20 people all wearing swastikas or something like that, to where it'd be crazy for you to miss it. So as you saw in that clip, it's like the kind of individuals just kind of blended in, or not even necessarily blending in, because actually his hoodie kind of stands out because it's black, and a lot of people there have, the red hats and whatnot. But just in general, because of how chaotic this scene is and how fast the pace of it all too is, people, it's one thing to go back and analyze the video after the fact, but this all transpires in a matter of minutes. It's a matter of minutes between the moment that those windows are broken and what you're seeing there with the scene of them pushing. So it's like you're trying to process the whole entire thing. There's people breaking in, and there's people storming in, and there's people now filing in, and now there's people pounding on doors. And then the next thing you know, you're just in this room with all of that. And so things like that, it gets a lot of media attention. And I think part of that is the privilege of hindsight, of being able to go back and analyze in more detail things that in the moment are just almost impossible to catch.
Right. And somebody does ask or comments that you must have been shitting yourself, but tell me, what was your state of mind when you're in the middle of this push like that? I'll say from my perspective, I certainly could tell early on when I arrived at the Capitol, we were witnessing something that was unique to it in it of itself. Were there moments, and you could compare this to other moments, you've been everywhere. So were there moments where your heart skips a beat?
Oh, definitely. Because it wasn't even just the individual acts. Like, I've seen a whole bunch of windows broken in the past year. Kenosha, Portland, and whatnot. It's the context. This isn't just any window. This is windows of the Capitol building. This isn't just any building that they've now stormed and are pushing through. It's literally the U.S. Capitol. So there were some moments, like in that room too, in particular, when they surged forward, because you just have no idea what direction this is going to go in. In my mind, I thought once people started streaming in, that there'd be some pushback. Police would come out. They would start tear gassing. I was wondering if we'd see tear gas in the halls of the Capitol building, because given all these past protests, there was a heavy police reaction. It was, start firing rubber bullets. It was, start tear gassing, start making mass arrests, start cordoning people off, trying to box them in, and then just wait for more officers to arrive so that you can arrest them. So, all of that, has happened at these previous ones. And then you just see this totally different, totally unique situation where the police aren't pushing back as much, or there just aren't enough police there. And so that's why they're not able to control the crowd. And because of that, it leads to this totally unpredictable situation where like literally anything could have happened. Literally, I have no idea if they're about to start tearing into things, if they're just going to surge forward and make their way into the chamber. Like, this is totally new, just something that really has not been seen before. So it was hard because there's just, as much as I was trying in my mind to compare some individual moments like, oh yeah, line of police. We've seen a lot of lines of police, but it's like still totally different because it's line of police inside the Capitol. They're already in. Like we're already way past the point that ever would have happened in like Portland with that federal courthouse, those federal buildings. Like they never even got to the point where they were in the interior. So there was no protocol, at least in my own mind, of like, okay, what tends to happen once they breach the building? Because they don't typically breach the building.
Right. It was definitely that opportunistic or moment of this is a once in a lifetime sort of thing taking place in front of us. I mean, I certainly felt that myself. The interesting thing is, I know you have your pulse on everything somehow that's going on because you managed to get everywhere. So it means you must be listening on teleport. Is that the mode of preference when it comes to transportation? Because you have been everywhere except Texas, as we established. But you must have been watching back in September when the anarchists who are behind Occupy Wall Street actually wanted to ignite a siege of the White House. They called it the White House siege back in September. And it fell flat. It never really materialized. But there was all of this talk of and promotion of what was first going to be called the White House siege on the 9th anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. Then it was sort of toned down that it was going to be an improvised artistic protest. And then nothing happened at all. Were you following that? I'm just curious.
Actually, no. I must have been caught up with whatever else was going on then, but I didn't catch wind of that. No.
Okay. It was interesting because at the time I had interviewed one of the anarchists who was part of this group that had taken responsibility or organizational roles in Occupy Wall Street. And that's one thing that was very reminiscent of to me is that the left had kind of talked up this sort of huge moment of rebellion. And we did see that at the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis. Now, have you been in Minneapolis?
Yes. Yeah, I was actually there. So the night of that 3rd precinct burning down there, I arrived in Minneapolis the following night.
Okay. So Friday,
yeah.
The 29th.
Yep. So still when things were still burning before they had gotten it out of control, it wasn't until then that Saturday that they clamped down and started mass arresting and doing all that.
Okay. You know what? I'm going to play this one clip from Minneapolis. It's a wrong clip there. It's a clip that I got from a foreign news. I contact them. It's a foreign news agency of Minneapolis the night of the precinct. And this is an interesting clip. Take a look. So, as I said, it was a foreign news agency that captured this, that I contacted. This fellow in the Bermuda hat is saying this is not what it is. As the fellow behind him jumps behind him, then this guy with a military helmet jumps in. So early on, I had seen this clip. This guy's not even wearing a mask there, which led me to believe, what's that story? Because most people who are on the left wear masks. So early on, go ahead.
I would say with Minneapolis, it's interesting you say that. It's important to remember the context too, though. Late May, it wasn't quite as totally universal with the masks yet. So there were many people I saw, even people breaking into Wells Fargo and whatnot, no mask on, because it really wasn't until late June that became taken seriously across the country. Obviously, most had masks, but there was still a sizable number of people, even on the left and whatnot, that did not have masks at that time because it wasn't quite late May. It still wasn't quite there across the country yet.
Thank you. That's a great point. Now, this is the first video among the first video I saw from Minneapolis. I got sort of swept into the story that Saturday. I was watching the Fairfax riots, which in which police cars were burned, and then the Melrose businesses were burned on Melrose. This is in Los Angeles, and then it got all the way up to the Target right down the street from me in Los Angeles. The next day, I was in Santa Monica. I'd actually just been surfing, and I was a witness to everything that went down in Santa Monica, California on the 31st. That was the Sunday, rather. So, but this video I saw early on, I went into this thinking I was going to find white supremacists everywhere. But what I ended up sort of finding was more cohesion and cultural revolutionary politics from the left. I'm just curious from your point of view. I mean, and you can see when I saw this video at first, I mean, there's somebody clearly in black bloc. I didn't know what to make of it. This woman is calling this young man back who's been given a golf club, it looks like. He has a golf club in his hand that he's awkwardly carrying, and he's joining the other folks. But I bring this up because I'm curious about the topic of infiltration. We do know at the Capitol there was a fellow named Jaden X, aka, or his real name is John Sullivan, that we know to be of the left, not necessarily anti-fascist, political left, but possibly more characterized as anarchist, wild card, chaos agent type. And when I look back at the Minneapolis video now, I had dismissed that because I had seen so much organization on the left that certainly one player does not represent the whole thing. Because you could talk about Jaden X and you say, okay, well, there were tens of thousands of Trump supporters there at critical mass. You can't really blame it on the one wild card chaos agent. But I'm just curious about your viewpoint because you've seen more than I have. And did the thought of infiltration cross your mind over the last 8 months, not just at the Capitol, but anywhere else?
Not at the Capitol specifically because of, like you said, the fact that there was that critical mass there. I mean, this is an event that was promoted 4 weeks ahead of time, conservative organizers getting buses together from across the country, not for a siege specifically, but for what they believe to be a peaceful demonstration there. And so, yeah, so the bulk of that, there was no way that was an infiltration because you had to have that critical mass of people there. If just agitators showed up, even if there were some, it would not have been enough to overwhelm the entire Capitol Police Department and get into there. That being said, one night in particular that I remember thinking, man, like, was there infiltration here? Like, it seemed just really off the way that the night progressed, was night 100 in Portland. So I believe that was September 6th, their night 100 of continuous protests / riots after the George Floyd death. And the march had started in this park. Police had blocked them off right at basically a block away from the park. Normally, they would just let the march make their way through the neighborhoods and then block them from getting closer to the police station once they were like right there. In this case, since they had already done that for multiple nights and the protesters were like right outside of the police station, in an attempt to prevent that from happening, they showed up actually basically a block away from the park and wouldn't even let them march away from the park. And so within a few minutes of that confrontation, a Molotov cocktail was thrown at the police, which then led to that one viral video. A lot of people probably remember the man with his feet on fire running away from that flame. So that was all that night 100 in Portland. But it was unusual because the couple nights prior had not had that sort of escalation so quickly. Usually if somebody was doing any sort of fire setting, it was much closer to the police station. It generally didn't happen anywhere near the park where the march began. The only exception to that would be if it was in downtown Portland, where the park is literally across the street from the federal courthouse. But in most cases, they would wait on sort of those tactics, throwing Molotov cocktails or any sort of the more violent tactics, until they were closer to the police station. So when it escalated, literally within minutes of the police arriving and within minutes of people trying to mobilize in that direction, it just seems so odd because within seconds of that being thrown, police are on the LRAD making an announcement, this has been declared a riot. But it was almost like, wow, really opportune that this march that you didn't want to proceed anyway, which up until that point had been peaceful, because it had literally just begun. Like they had literally just gathered in the park for about an hour is usually about their wait time before they get moving. It varies depending on the event. But so of course at that time they're just talking in the park. Nothing's happened yet. And so it was really unusual that like that quickly, a very opportune event in the sense of, the Molotov cocktail being thrown, that it could immediately be declared a riot. Immediately then police are able to move in and, fire tear gas into the neighborhood, which then, the night progressed as it did.
So I'm smiling because I know something, because I studied that night and a lot of the material coming in and a lot of the promotional material. So I'm going to be able to address that in a very interesting way. But before I do, I just want to ask really quick, how many times did you go to Portland?
Well, I mean, how many separate trips?
Yeah, separate trips. Because it's just,
okay.
I kept having to come back. I kept going back there and going back there. And you and I on June the 24th were both in Tacoma, which is very close in Washington.
January
So you keep going back to either Seattle or Portland. It seems, at least for me, I just kept getting drawn back there. How many times do you think you flew into Seattle or Portland?
I would say at least 8 different occasions, probably. Yeah. I mean, some of those then were like a multi-day trip. Like the Tacoma one, there had been a Seattle protest, followed by a Portland protest, followed by the Tacoma. So all that was one continuous.
You just stayed there the whole week.
Yeah, and bop around from one to the other. Yeah. A lot of times.
I came back from Portland after the inauguration night, the attack on the ICE facility, which I'm sure you were at. And
I was in Seattle for that night.
Oh yeah, you were in Seattle that night. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, I was in Portland that night. Then I went back to LA, and then I was like, you know what? I just got to do one more, and then I went back to Tacoma. So I was just like, this is what happens. You're like, when you're really trying to follow a story like this, you get drawn back, especially to the Pacific Northwest, where the culture of leftist riot action is very much entrenched.
Yeah.
Into the
really unlike anywhere else in the country. I mean, there's just no other region that has that amount of organizing and the frequency of demonstrations, frequency of protests, and then the just the sort of regularization of those tactics that, like, to the point where now you see fireworks thrown at the Portland police. It's like, oh yeah, there's Portland another night. And it's if I were to see that all of a sudden out of the blue against like the Dayton, Ohio police or something like that, it'd be like, oh wow, this is kind of crazy. This is all of a sudden happening. But yeah, Pacific Northwest, like you said, it's almost like a culture of it to an extent.
And that night that you're talking about, 100 days and 100 nights of protest, it was heavily promoted by a couple of groups that I've followed. Early on, I was watching the Pacific Northwest Youth Liberation Front, which is very active in organizing, I would say even more so than Rose City Antifa. And they have more of an anarchist, not necessarily a revolutionary anarchist approach, but devolution, which means you just take everything down. That's the philosophy of that, I guess, brand of insurrectionary anarchist action. Now, that day that you're talking about, that would have been the first week of September, correct? Towards the end of the first week of September.
It was Labor Day weekend, that Friday night.
Right. And the video, I almost ripped it and wanted to have it queued up, but I didn't. But the video, if you go back on Brendan, this is a good chance for us like you. That's Brendan on Twitter, BG on the scene. If you go to his Twitter and you scroll down to, I think it was around September the 6th or so, you will find this viral video where the Molotov cocktail gets thrown and a leftist is hit and his legs are lit on fire, roughly. And in your description of it, you say, well, it happened quick. Well, in the promotional material for 100 days and 100 nights of protest, the motto was, be water, spread fire. That's what it said on the digital flyer. So be water was this motto that came out of Hong Kong during the Hong Kong protests. And the idea is if the crowd is malleable and adjusts and acts like water and does not, it may have some sort of Chinese proverbial the phrase, I think, has some sort of lineage to it. And it came out of the Hong Kong protests against communist China. And the idea was if the crowd moves as water and does not, get stuck up against the police line, but is harder to track, then the protest will have more success. But specifically, that motto, be water, had been used all summer. And then that week, for the first time I saw it, was be water, spread fire. So, yeah. So I would have to say, from what I observed, that there was probably some premeditation and preparation when it came to Molotov cocktails being the drink of choice, shall we say, for that weekend, the beverage of choice. It's interesting to hear that, though, and take me. So we're skipping all over the place. We have to talk about Kenosha, because your video is of the second volley, if you will, the second episode in which Kyle Rittenhouse trips and falls. You had seen, in other words, there was a shooting previous. He's running from that lot. Take me to what that night had been like. And were you aware when you saw him running with a long gun that you were witnessing something that was unique to that evening?
So the Kenosha story had begun actually 2 nights prior with the first night of rioting. I wasn't in town for that yet. Second night, I had arrived there, so that was that Monday night. That had been very, very chaotic. Many businesses burned, apartments, whatnot. And then the third night, that Tuesday night, is when the shooting happened with Kyle Rittenhouse. And so basically, in terms of how that night had progressed, similar to the previous night with gathering near the courthouse, then kind of marching through the city a little bit. And then they kind of made their way back towards the courthouse, faced off with police there, who at that point had put up one of those giant fences, the 8-foot fences that have become so ubiquitous across the country now. Pretty much everybody's seen them, it seems. And they, police basically, it was really unusual. I mean, not too unusual, I should say, other than that they all kind of stayed inside the fence. It was a lot of like this force inside the fence for a while there. And protesters were, of course, then just right outside the fence, yelling at police, whatnot. As the night went on, it got a little more aggressive, people throwing some things, water bottles, occasionally rocks. They had some police come outside and try to push the crowd away from the courthouse altogether and away from the park that was right outside of there. And so in doing so, they pushed them a couple blocks south and got them away from the courthouse and away from the, those sort of government buildings that were in that area, and then pushed them further south into more the neighborhoods and smaller business area. That area was where you had some of these militia types, people that wanted to take up arms. It wasn't even necessarily like organized militia. Some of them, it was just like kind of like anybody that's against the rioting, which generally speaking, those call to actions spoke to people on the right, to take up arms and defend businesses. And in that sense, it was to just basically stand on those properties and not let anybody tear them down or break into them, set them on fire, etc. And so I saw these groups. They hung out a lot at the gas stations there in Kenosha. You'll see a lot of pictures and images of them there. They also hung out by like these used car lots, including that one where that first shooting had happened. And so kind of like how that night had progressed, once the crowd had been pushed away from the courthouse and they had been tear gassed and, flashbangs, all that, the, usual things that you see with the crowd control, people were pushed down. And then there were some people who were milling about. It was really unusual, actually, because like already there had been several hours of action back and forth with the police. And so got to the point it was a bit past 11 p.m. Some people had gone home. Some of it had fizzled out, but there was still a lot of people there. And it was this very tense atmosphere. It was a lot of people that were carrying around poles or crowbars, bats, just kind of like openly. At that point, everybody has a mask on. It's not like Minneapolis late night. At that point, everybody's masked. And then you just had all these, people there that were there for the protests for Jacob Blake, and then these right-wing militias or, those type of people taking up arms at these businesses. And there wasn't anything actively happening for a while. Like it was kind of like a lull in the action where people were just kind of milling about, kind of just like there for a couple blocks, just kind of spread out. And so a lot of the mainstream media had gone home. A lot of media in general had gone home. Even somebody that I had been talking with throughout that night there, there was also there to cover things. It was like, yeah, I think I'm going to head out. You know, it seems like things are really dying down. And there was just something about the atmosphere, something in the air that seemed unusual still. Like all these people are still out, all these bats, all these weapons and whatnot, and really no police presence here because police were hanging out over by the courthouse and they were just trying to defend that property for the most part. And so really you just had this melee of people, melee isn't the right word, just kind of potpourri of people all there. And I just felt like there was still potential for something to happen. So I stayed. And sure enough, about 15 minutes later, I hear gunshots about a block away, south from me. I just hear gunshots go off in the air. I'm like, oh my gosh. So I start running towards it. A lot of people also did. Others were running away from it. I wanted to go to capture, find out what was going on. And as I approach, I see somebody running away from that scene, Kyle Rittenhouse, I now know, and a lot of people that were near him, chasing him, saying, yo, that dude just shot someone, get him. He just shot someone, he just killed someone. They were just basically yelling all of that as he's now then running north towards the courthouse, towards where the police were and whatnot, a few blocks up. And that's where my video starts, where I kind of just like show him and people are chasing after him and he's running. And then at one point he gets to a part of the road. It looked like maybe like a pothole or a crack in the road, something, trips, falls down. People kind of close in on him and, he fires at them, shoots at least two people right there. There might have been a third person that was hit there, but wasn't killed in that specific shooting. This all happening after the first one, which I did not witness, but I heard the gunshots in the air because it was fairly close by. And yeah, and so then that happened. As we now know, multiple people died from that. And then he stood up. At that point, people were no longer trying to close in or get any closer. At that point, everybody scattered for the most part. And he just stood up, walked towards the police. It's that infamous video now with him with his hands in the air, and then goes up, says something to police. It looks like the police, initially one of the ones in a Bearcat asked, is there somebody injured down there? And he points in the direction of the people that he had just shot. And then he further walks up to like police car, not the Bearcat, and says something to them. I can't really make it out because I'm a little bit too far away. But whatever it was, I could hear the police kind of yelling back, get away from the car, get out of here, go, just really telling Kyle to just go home. And then he pretty much just leaves there. And that's that. And a few seconds later, police come in. They put up caution tape around the scene for, a crime scene and, attend to the bodies there in the street.
What was your reaction then in the next couple of days when you see how the media portrays, something that you just mentioned, which is the feeling in the air of people just hanging out? It almost, to me, as I was watching, I reviewed all these different streams. It's almost as if, after the bar is out at 2 a.m. and people are just hanging out and they don't want to go home because there's this sort of agitated energy that's something is supposed to happen. And I couldn't help but be reminded of that. I think that when you look at the video of the whole night, there's all these different streams. I played in the last episode a clip in which Kyle Rittenhouse is offering medical aid to Black Lives Matter protesters. You see him so many times in live streams offering medical aid. He's such a Boy Scout about, hey, I'm a medic. And he's doing that all over the place. You were there. You saw what happened, and I'm sure you studied it a lot since. What was your immediate reaction to how it was portrayed in the media?
It seemed very misleading to argue that somebody came there, like Kyle, specifically looking to commit these acts. That was the one part that I saw plastered across the media, and it struck me as just so one, like assuming it's not that that isn't possible, but there's no way that they could possibly have that kind of confirmation within hours of the event happening. Oh yeah, he specifically went there for that. And then as I did more research, and I found like there just really wasn't any evidence to suggest that like it was specifically going there with the intention of committing violence. And then of course people will argue, well then why have the gun? Why be open carrying? To that is just there have been so many different protests and demonstrations with open carry. That in and of itself didn't strike me as unusual from it, because people were doing that in Michigan, people were doing that in Ohio, people are doing that all over the place, not in DC. But it just, seeing that reaction in the media, it's one thing to cover it and say that people are shot. It's another thing to start adding in these motivations and adding in these assumptions of, oh, he must have been part of this, or he must have been trying to further this political point, or things like that. And just immediately just this everybody just hopped onto that. Just, oh, yep, right wingers came looking for violence, trying to shoot up protesters, and people just ran with that so much that it got lost, the details of like how did that night actually progress and like what actually went down there. And really there was no attention paid to some of the more, well, I shouldn't say no attention paid, because it kind of depended on what media outlet you were looking at with this. Because obviously a lot of the right-wing leaning media was very quick to defend him and say this is all self-defense, this is that. And so it's not that it's not that everybody made the same argument, but it just seemed that everybody wanted to immediately politicize it and add in motivations or add in justifications, whatever it might be, and just roll with that as fact, as opposed to saying, hey, we suspect this, or we think this could have been it, or there's a possibility this, but they just like ran it down as fact. And that just seemed really, really irresponsible to me.
The truth, as I have found from the street, is much more complicated. It's messier. It doesn't fit neatly into somebody's right or left propaganda point that they want to make necessarily. And I can't help but think about what you're saying and connect it with the Capitol. Because as I said, armed insurrection trended on Twitter about the Capitol, even though neither you, myself, nor anybody has been able to seen or been shown a picture of somebody with a gun. And not only that, but white supremacy became the characterizing talking point of the Capitol. And I mentioned that Atlantic study where I said 1 out of 10 were only affiliated with groups. That same author I contacted and I asked, well, how many of these people, because on their graph they had a 1% mark for people who belonged to ethno gangs. And I thought, well, is that white supremacist? And just an aside note, you actually capture an image of the America First flag in the Capitol. You know that what flag I'm talking about? That's the Groypers,
Nick Fuentes crowd. That, yes, yep.
That's like a young kid brother of the alt-right, so to speak. That's the best way I can characterize it to people. It's the closest that I think we might have to white nationalists. I don't know. How would you respond to that? I don't know.
I will say first, I haven't done as deep a dive as I would like on that yet to have all the details. So there may be some information that I don't have yet. It doesn't strike me as very strong, like white nationalist. It seems much more focused on the nationalist part. It seems like really it's the America First agenda. It's the, let's worry about America and then screw all the other countries, or just really not care about their problems so much. You focus on America's problems first. That seems to be the general sentiment. I don't see as much on the
ethno
part of it. Yeah. And again, I have to preface that by saying like I haven't done as deep a dive as I would like to know, are there elements of that in there? But I certainly haven't seen that featured prominently to the point where it was making itself known in any of the demonstrations I saw. And thankfully, at least in terms of trying to get a better understanding of this, I had seen some of these groups in other places. In Atlanta, there were a group of like the Groypers, America First.
I saw them there too. I was there that day too.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. And then Lansing too, they had done a demonstration. So that kind of gave me a little bit more perspective than also the other DC protests too in November and December. So that, yeah, I didn't get a strong... yes, the groups were both white people. Definitely, it was mostly white people. Some of them, I think at the Lansing capital might have been just all white people, but it didn't strike me as like a very strongly emphasized part of it or really even mentioned.
Something just came to my mind that I forgot. A lot of people don't realize that on January the 5th, the night before, you have a lot of video. And again, if you go to his Twitter right there, and if you scroll down to January 5th, for you have a lot of video at Black Lives Matter Plaza. There were clashes already the night before between police and right-wing protesters, Trump-led, Trump-supporting protesters. Some of them barked grievances over COVID restrictions. Some barked grievances against big tech and media that night, I noticed on January. But you capture a lot of that melee that took place at Black Lives Matter Plaza. Interestingly enough, because there were so many right-wingers, that Black Lives Matter Plaza was virtually empty that night for leftists, correct?
Yeah, because and I'm sure you saw this too with paying attention to a lot of the groups that would otherwise be organizing protests. I saw a lot of them explicitly saying, don't show up, don't counter protests. Basically, there's going to be too many people there that it was going to potentially jeopardize their safety in their view. So I saw a lot of groups actively saying, don't demonstrate there, don't go out on the 5th or the 6th, and just trying to stay away. And a lot of them, it seemed to focus their energy on more of the, how would I want to, basically things that could be done at home. So like calling in Harry's to try to get them to shut down for the couple days.
The hotels, they did a whole campaign at the hotels.
Yeah, basically any of like the either online or phone mobile campaigns that can be done instead of just in-person demonstration, actively pushing back against people there in person.
And that ties into one question that I get asked a lot. Was Antifa there at the Capitol? And the way I answer it, and you can give me your answer and tell me if this jives with you, is I tell them there's a difference between Antifa and anarchists. Antifa is left politically, and their photographers were there. They had a couple photographers who were there filming, and what that allows them to cherry pick the video of people just walking past the police. They can take that video and say, hey, look, it's all unfair. It's all unfair based on race because people just walked in. Now, based on the video that we showed, that you took and that we witnessed, and now people, I think, understand much later in the game that people didn't just walk in. But they are there in a propaganda capacity, which works because if you tie it back to Kenosha, these storylines come from the activist left, that white supremacy, Kenosha, white supremacy, Capitol, white supremacy. These are spun, as I discovered in Twitter. People were tweeting about white supremacy in the 2 p.m. hour at the Capitol already. So we didn't even know then that Ashley Babbitt had been shot and killed. And one activist from the Pacific Northwest, who I'm sure you know, but I won't mention right now, but who is an activist reporter, was tweeting out, if this were Black people, they would have been shot with live rounds. Well, within a half hour, someone was shot and killed with them. But what I'm saying is that there is an activist, and it comes from Twitter. It comes from people promoting certain trending talking points, which then get tabloided out, and soon enough they're in the mainstream media, which is concerning, I would say. But the difference that I make is between Antifa groups who, again, you point out, also Black Lives Matter DMV, which is Black Lives Matter DC, Maryland, Virginia. They are the ones who right before January the 5th, they said don't go out. It's going to be too dangerous. And so just tell me for a second, on January 5th though, were you surprised to see the right wing Trump supporters marching on Black Lives Matter Plaza, but not only that, actively clashing with police on January 5th in Washington, D.C.?
I was not surprised at all.
You were not?
A big part of that, if you go back just a couple days prior on my feed, January 1st, as it turns out, ended up being this sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of like a predictor, or just sort of a...
The canary in the coal mine.
Yeah, canary in the coal mine, a little prologue for what could potentially to come, because what had happened was on January 1st in Salem, Oregon, there were protests. It was like a right-wing protest. That one, a lot of like the Trump supporters, people out trying to protest against the lockdown restrictions, things like that. And that march had gone. They protested at the Capitol, which then led to the governor's house and then back towards the Capitol. When they got back towards the Capitol, there were a few Antifa that had been organizing in one of the parks nearby in Salem, but they pretty much just kept there. And then a couple of them were trying to march. A lot of the organizers, it sounded like from what I got after the fact from people that had been reporting on that, really weren't trying to emphasize like clashing with Trump supporters or clashing with the right wing. It really didn't seem like they were going for too much of that. A handful of them ended up going out into the streets. And then police, seeing that there were now, a couple people in Black Bloc or Antifa, and then there's still Trump supporters out, decided to cordon off a couple intersections and start trying to like form lines between them, even though it really at that point wasn't that many people. Like I want to emphasize, it wasn't like a crowd of hundreds of Antifa or hundreds of Trump supporters. Even at that point, it was so late in the day, couple dozen on the Trump supporter side and maybe 10 or so on the Antifa side, and a massive police presence. And what ended up happening was the Proud Boys that were there, still wearing the Proud Boys insignia, wasn't undercover like some of the Capitol stuff. They were mad at the police basically for doing this, for shutting this down, and for having this massive show of force for really what was not very many people out on the streets at that hour. And it just very quickly had escalated to the point where they were clashing with police. There was at least one arrest made that I saw, might have been a couple. Tear gas, smoke bombs being thrown out, and all this happening in Salem against the Proud Boys. It wasn't against Antifa, and it wasn't even, they were fighting, and so then police came to break it up. It was like kind of like police taking it upon themselves because people were refusing to just disperse at their orders to, push forward, start firing off the pepper balls at them, start throwing the smoke canisters, trying to disperse them. And Proud Boys kept pushing back and saying like, we've backed you guys for years now, or for the last year. Now you're fighting us. Why are you fighting us? And just getting really, really angry from that, really agitated. And I just saw a lot of this flipping a switch of not the back the blue sentiment anymore, but now this active anti-police sentiment, because they were just angry that they were, and some of the comments about oath breaking, heard a lot of that at the Capitol. I was still hearing that, I was hearing that a couple days prior in Salem, when some of them were saying, these police officers, we see them as breaking their oath by pushing back against the people that were supporting them. So that happened in Salem, and that was on January 1st. And so then when January 5th came, and it was again Proud Boys and Trump supporters and kind of just this hodgepodge of people out there, marching, and then police constantly following them or cordoning off certain areas, not letting them have access to the fence outside the White House that had been like the Black Lives Matter murals and stuff. They clashed, and I guess I really wasn't that surprised on that day, because just a few days prior that had happened in Salem.
Sorry.
That was okay.
So I just left my phone. And that was actually the second of the Salem protests, because there was one in December as well.
Yes, yeah, and I should separate those two. This
was the second one,
1st or so, something like that, December 21st or 22nd.
There was one that was before Christmas, in the week before Christmas, and then there was the one that you were at, which was on January the 1st or
first. Yeah, it was on New Year's Day. It was
on New Year's Day.
Yeah.
Wow. And I'm brought to mind a couple of your clips. They play through my mind. I've watched I've seen all your work. And one video, I think that day, is somebody actually saying exactly that. On January the 5th in the evening at Black Lives Matter Plaza, they said, "We're not going to back you anymore. We backed you, and we're not going to." And the narrative line sort of plays through that municipalities have been, or from their mind, that not overreaching with restrictions, and I recognize that clip. Another thing that happened that night, we had talked about that Groyper nationalist, and I think your comparison is very fair. I know they're one of these groups, and this is where the Proud Boys sort of get the activist media is able to have their way with these groups, because if your leader or your most vocal people think they can say anything, well, pretty soon everything that you've done, from an okay sign to somebody said this one time to somebody used this racial slur one time, that is used to portray the whole entire bunch. And I know that that's happened a lot to the with the Proud Boys. Is there any impression that you had early on about the Proud Boys that did or did not change as you got deeper into the story?
I don't think I'm quite understanding that question.
Did you think, when the first time that you went to cover Proud Boys, did you think of them as a certain way? Did that change at all over the course of time of covering Proud Boys?
I would say when I went in, it was just a big unknown for me. Kind of like, okay, I've heard of these names, I've heard of these groups, seen a couple photos, videos of demonstrations, but I didn't really know what to make of them. To be honest, there's been so much like media sensationalism around so many groups on the left and on the right that at a certain point, I just I get what I can that's valuable information, but I don't draw my end conclusions from what's being said on, the different media outlets describing these groups. So basically, when I started covering them, it was more of an open mind of, I don't really know a whole lot. Show me, what it is you do, or what it is you say, what you chant, what it is that goes on when you are at these demonstrations, at these protests. Some of the first times I saw them was actually in Lansing at the Michigan State Capitol, because there would be several different ones where they would show up there. And then in some of the more like Portland, where they would have more organized like Proud Boys rally. And then of course, people would organize against those who would lead to those counter protests. And
Lansing, you say Lansing. I just want to go back to that. So that's open carry. Those were those first protests back at it was the last day of April, was it? Where there was a protest at the Michigan Capitol, right?
Yeah. So to walk people through that timeline just briefly, the anti-lockdown protest movement in general in the U.S. actually started with Lansing, with April 15th. There really wasn't any anti-lockdown protests prior to that anywhere. And then that one was what they called Operation Gridlock, and they pretty much just created a massive traffic jam throughout the city of Lansing and kind of just shut down all the traffic there. 2 weeks later, they came back to the Capitol. So that was April 30th, the last day of April, and they did the inside the Capitol protests then, where what was happening, the context was a legislative session was meeting to discuss whether or not to extend the authority for Governor Gretchen Whitmer to continue to issue executive orders on the emergency, basically declaring a state of emergency for the pandemic and then issuing orders on that. It was set to expire on April 30th. Basically, these orders from that point forward weren't going to be valid unless the legislature voted to give her that authority. And so they were meeting at the Capitol to have that discussion. People, of course, anti-lockdown protest side were wanting to push the lawmakers towards not giving her that authorization. So they organized the protest there. And then with Michigan specifically, and this is another one of those things where I see media reports about it after, and I'm like, this is just not accurate. It's just that they have been calling it lately an armed intrusion of the Capitol, an armed intrusion of the Michigan State Capitol. And I was reading that and I'm like, there was no armed intrusion because they actually just let them in. That one, it really is legal to carry firearms inside the Capitol building. So people just walked in the front door, went through a police. They were doing temperature checks at the door, and then just made their way inside from that point. So there really wasn't any storming of the Capitol in that sense. They just kind of all filed in individually and then packed inside of there. And then once they were inside, that's where those videos emerged of, things getting pretty rowdy outside of the legislative session doors. They closed the doors, weren't letting people up into the gallery, which ordinarily you can. And then people just chanting, let us in, trying to get in there. And eventually that just dispersed peacefully as well. It didn't lead to anything. People weren't breaking windows or breaking down doors or anything.
We got some heated images, I think, that were from that of people yelling at officers. Certainly, I think the sensationalism comes to, you know, if you're from the upper Midwest, right? So,
Yeah.
so you've been around this. You know, I'm from California, and this is just a cultural point. I've lived in California and New York and worked in media. If you're from California or New York, you're not around guns a lot. And so your media perception of guns in general is, I've seen more guns, you know, in the last 8 months, of course, than I've seen in my entire life. But that's because, you know, I was in Louisville where I was there on the Kentucky Derby day where you had all, were you there that day too?
I was not, but that was one of those days that I watched quite a bit out of just because of all that happened that day.
Yeah, I mean, there were so many different militias. The NFAC showed up, which is the black militia, and they had a standoff at Churchill Downs with the Louisville Police Department. And then you had now this is what was interesting. The militias that were from the right decided to start their action at 8 a.m. And I would say that's a pretty astute way to do it, in the sense that if you know everybody's going to have guns, then that the NFAC did their protest at 7 p.m. and then the right did theirs at 8 a.m. I'd say that was pretty smart on the hand of just sort of self-preservation. You don't want people with guns clashing. How have you seen that play out in the regards to Michigan? And as far as different groups with guns, do the leftists have guns? Have you seen leftists with guns as well in the upper Midwest area?
Occasionally, yeah. It's not as common with like throngs of them all with guns. You know, I wouldn't even bat too many eyes if I saw 100 people with guns at one of the right-wing protests at the Capitol. If I saw 100 on the left wing with guns, it probably would have been more of a shock there specifically for Lansing, just because it's not as typical. But they do sometimes come out. Like I know at the December 23rd, they had a protest against Gretchen Whitmer, against the lockdowns as well. And that one, a few of the Antifa left-wing counter-protesters had come armed as well. Generally, when I see that happen, there was another city too. Oh, Richmond,
Tacoma.
Virginia.
Oh.
Well, I'm trying to think of places where I've seen an individual event where simultaneously people on the right and the left both had guns. So I've seen that in Lansing and in Richmond, probably a few other places too. Just can't think of even off the top of my head. And generally, it's played out fine. I actually have yet to see any sort of incident unfold from that. Usually when people do it, especially when it's at these state capitals, there's usually some police presence around, and people are very mindful of their firearms. And the other thing too is with the Midwest, is such an interesting point that you brought up about, you know, living in either California or New York, not really seeing guns a lot, versus like if you were to go to the Michigan State Capitol, most protests, almost all of them, actually, there's people open carrying. It may be a few, it may be a lot. Like they have a Second Amendment rally they do there as well. I had covered that back in September. And so there you have just a whole plethora of people that have firearms. And so as somebody that is covering a lot of that, you become more accustomed to it or just more used to seeing it, to where then you see some of these headlines of, you know, armed this or armed that, and like people that really like seem shocked that like anybody would come to any protest with guns. Whereas if you're from the Midwest or Kentucky or Ohio, places like that, it's actually kind of become a frequent thing over the last year.
Yeah, I think it is a little bit of a culture shock for writers who are on the coasts. And specifically when I say that, I mean, you know, New York, but even, you know, in California, those portions of the coast where our media outlets are consolidated, whether it's tech or corporate media, I think that a lot of writers just don't understand it and are culturally not used to it. I certainly, in some ways, have been around it a lot more in this last year in a way that I never anticipated. But, you know, you bring up an interesting point, because with Michigan, if it's almost expected sometimes there can be major mistakes. And one of them is a story of December the 5th. Now, on December the 5th, I was undercover in Sacramento, which I know you've been to too, Sacramento.
Yep.
And that's a hot crowd, actually, because when they combine, especially with Berkeley Antifa, what happens is the Berkeley Bay Area people come up. It's only an hour drive. So they drive up to Sacramento, and they have more right-wingers in Sacramento. You don't have right-wingers walking around San Francisco and Berkeley all the time. So they make a field trip out of it, and they come up to Sacramento. And I think you were there in December.
Not that December 5th one, although I think I know the day you're about to refer to, because there were some clashes and like somebody that had gotten pushed. Well, I'll let you speak on that, but I remember seeing that, and then it was like a week or two later, another one of those weekly protests that I had gone to.
That you had gone to. Yeah. And they're a tricky crowd. I mean, you have to be on as you have to be on your toes all the time, I'm sure. I thought that Tacoma crowd was tricky too to shoot in, because someone asked why you don't live stream earlier, and I might as well bring that up. What have you found to be? It's hard to live stream in those crowds, because then if people in the crowd are looking and they know you and they're as well known as you, they can see that you're live streaming up and they can find you. I just answered the question for you, but from your perspective, what
that, and then another factor that people sometimes wouldn't know just from looking at things online, there are certain places where the internet connection is so limited that wouldn't even be an option. So like the US Capitol building, right. I could barely even get the videos out as it was, let alone try to live stream. Kenosha, no chance. Kenosha,
just too many people, too many cell phones.
Too many people's cell phones, and I have no idea if there was any sort of like police interference on signals, jamming, anything like that. I remember Portland, that night 100 in Portland. It was insane, the reception, but it was really weird, because if I walked like 1 or 2 blocks from the park, totally fine, which led me to believe that there might be some funny games going on there with the signals. But I don't have any information on that, so I won't speculate. But yeah, there are definitely a lot of these where either, like you said, the main one would be that you don't want to put yourself at risk. And then also conversely, sometimes that's not even an option. Sometimes it's like you're going to have to post the clips after the fact, because there's just no way to get it out live.
Yeah, for whatever reason, I was able to get a signal. Well, I know the reason. I was among the later people at the Capitol, and because of that, when I streamed the Bullhorn lady and that crew that was they were trashing offices on the northwest side of the Capitol. So it was kind of in this tucked in corner where they had found an entryway to these offices and they were trashing them. But when I look back at my live stream, it's very fractured when I'm outside. But once I get into the Capitol, for some reason it cleared up, and I got, from what I know, the only live stream in the Capitol, and it was just by chance. And in some ways,
must have, yeah, because I remember seeing you say that, like that you were live streaming. And I remember going like, how? Because like nobody else did. So you must have been the one person that had.
And it was because
just enough signal, just enough to get in there.
And it was because I was late, and because I was late, I was there from 2 to 3, and then at 3 in the 3 p.m. hour, I had gone down and live streamed from the circle, the street at the edge of the park, and then I had gone back at 4, and then started the live stream at 5. So I was on the later end of it, and I think that's why that happened. But going back to, and I know you got to go. We've already gone, way over, and
okay, it's been a good conversation.
It's a great I mean, we could go for a long time, I'm sure, about
a number of topics. Yeah,
about a number of these topics. But let's just take it back to the gun thing, because I want to get your take on. And I think when I first talked to you, I told you about this, a story that I broke on December the 5th. Now, the reason that I was so interested in Michigan on December the 5th is it dominated our national headlines. Here I am in Sacramento, and I'm watching this group fully launch an attack on regular Trump normies, which is what we saw November the 14th in, were you there November the 14th in DC?
Yep. Just like Bush attacks, basically.
It was, I mean, from what I could tell, and correct me if I'm wrong, I talked to Richie about this, and on November the 14th, you got to think the left has just won the election. These leftist activists were not magnanimous in victory, so to speak, or in any way. The Black Bloc, after a Trump rally on November the 14th, all the daylight video is the Black Bloc attacking normal MAGA Trump supporters who are returning from Freedom Plaza. They're passing the White House. Richie pointed out that, they might have been done with the Freedom Plaza, which is a mile away, and gone to see the White House. They could have been crossing to, Black Lives Matter Plaza is on the north side of the White House, just they're butted up right next to each other. They could have been at a hotel that was on the other side, that was on the west side of Black Lives Matter Plaza, and they'd crossed through. Well, in doing so, if you do not have a mask and you are near Black Lives Matter Plaza, it was assumed you were a Trump supporter in December when I was there, and the mob would come after you. What did you see on November the 14th?
Very similar. I mean, that's a very accurate description. Pretty much you had these peaceful demonstrations at Freedom Plaza, speeches, people celebrating, waving their flags, cheering, all of that. And then trying to remember, I know in December they had gone over by the Supreme Court. I don't believe they did as much of that on the November 14th one. But then you just had some people kind of milling about. And then once they were leaving Freedom Plaza, like you said, crossing through Black Lives Matter Plaza. And if you were anybody that either had a MAGA hat or wasn't wearing a mask, so then they assume you're an anti-masker and probably a Trump supporter, or, making just assumptions of anybody based on hat, outfit, mask or not mask, and then going after those people. So I saw people that would get water thrown at them, some people that would just get sucker punched from behind, others that would kind of just get surrounded and then like harassed and chased out of the area. And so it was just a variety of that. And it was very much on that night, like they were actively seeking those people out. It wasn't even, these confrontations happened and then it just escalated. It was like, they would harass one person, chase that person out of the plaza, and then they would like go looking for somebody else. And then they would turn the group around and then, okay, there's one. Or, some other people, because it was just kind of like a many people, kind of hundreds out there. So you'd have a small group of them that would chase one person. And then once they were done with that, there's a small group starting to harass this person, and more people come in, and then more people follow that person. And that's pretty much how it went on November 14th. And then later that night, because that was like in the daytime, late afternoon, early evening, and then later that night, you saw more of like the Proud Boys openly marching, and then some of those clashes sort of fighting back there.
And they tore down signs in the evening.
Yeah.
That kind of thing at the Labor Building, which is in Black Lives Matter Plaza. Yeah. I spoke to the young man who's in a red hoodie from December the 5th. He was sheltering his girlfriend, and they were having liquid thrown at them. And he told me that it's actually a medic, a Black Bloc with a red cross that threw the liquid, and he said it was chemicals that were thrown on them on November the 14th. So that
I remember seeing that couple. I had seen them not when the liquid was thrown, but as they were getting chased out, and it was the young. They were both white and looked very young.
Very young. He had a red hoodie, kind of longish, dark hair.
Yeah.
And at one point, he's hiding his girlfriend like this, trying to shelter her as they're just throwing liquids and stuff at him.
And she's just like in tears, pretty much. Yeah, I remember that.
So November the 14th, again, that's where if you when you try to trace the political violence, this is in my research, the rioting started the night Trump was elected in San Francisco. It spread to Oakland. There was actual rioting. I'm from the Bay Area. I was born in Berkeley. So I took it on myself to research this extensively, that it was the Bay Area before it was the Pacific Northwest on Inauguration Day. There were conflicts.
Are you talking about November of 2016 for that?
Yeah, I'm talking about November 2016. So if you trace the political violence back, it starts with Trump's election. Now, you can make arguments that certain other events of violence took place, whether it's lone wolf shootings, a strange, odd circumstance that I looked up. Trump announces his candidacy when he's going down the escalator we all know from Trump Plaza. Within 24 hours is the Dylan Roof shooting, in which Dylan Roof kills 9 people at a Carolina black church. So there's, people make certain arguments that, well, the violence has come from the right, from these racist lone wolves, but the political violence to shut that down, that ties it all together, started on the night of Trump's election. So it's a very layered, complex, messy set of circumstances, and I would even say media truths that we're dealing with that are not necessarily the same thing as the truth that you and I see. There are these media truths that are pitched. I think most people believe now that even the Southern Poverty Law Center characterized the Capitol on January the 6th as a to preserve white supremacy is how they characterized that. And I asked them at the press conference, what evidence do you have to support that? And this goes back to that Atlantic article. Again, they characterized 1 out of 10 being of actual membership groups. I had mentioned that they said 1% was of an ethno-gang affiliation. The guy wrote me back and he told me, the ethno gang was only one person that they characterized as the 1% of the 193 people that were arrested. And he said the gang in question was the Latin Kings. He said, not a white supremacist group. He said, we found no evidence of white supremacist groups such as Hammerskins or, neo-Nazi skinheads or these type of Aryan Brotherhood gangs, which we seem to be painting everybody by, because we saw one guy with a Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt in that video clip even that we played earlier. But it's interesting that the media paints with such a broad activist brush, because that's where, again, just like you spoke of Kenosha and you saw the media narrative sort of spinning in this one direction, so I think we have seen with the Capitol, though it's not supported with actual evidence. That's kind of my take as of right now. More might come out, but even the Groypers, who we mentioned, I brought up January the 5th. Philip Anderson, who is a black guy from, I think, Texas, who's a right-wing organizer, who I ended up interviewing later on the 6th. But he got attacked in San Francisco on October the 17th, and he had his 2 front teeth knocked out by carbon fiber gloves by a guy in black bloc. Now, because he's black, actual hate crime charges were brought up against the guy who was also a person of color who hit him, who was in black bloc. This was organized by none other than Berkeley Antifa in Antifa Sacramento. This time, the Sacramento folks coming down in support, in solidarity to San Francisco. Philip Anderson, who is, he lost his 2 front teeth with that hit. I saw him on January the 5th signaling the Groypers to come over with him, and they chased away the Fox News live shot. I don't know if you saw that on January the 5th. It was at the later part of the evening. So now, again, I'm always showing up late because I'm like, you're there right on time. You get all of the stuff. But I showed up late on January the 5th. And that's actually because my flight was delayed coming in from the West Coast. But I came in and I shot this moment towards the very end of the night, because you had shot all that video of the clashes at Black Lives Matter Plaza. But Philip Anderson had said, "Hey, Groypers," and he signals them over, and they team up to chase out a Fox News reporter and they're basically chanting F Fox News because they've decided that Fox News is now traitorous in some ways, and they chased the guy doing his live shot out from the area. So I connect that moment because we were talking about them in terms of nationalist or ethno-nationalist. Well, here they were collaborating with Philip Anderson, and by the end he had his shirt off and they were all like jumping around him and stuff. So that again is why I would classify them as more nationalist maybe than ethno-nationalist. And curious again that when you try to get support of actual ethno-nationalism, this is a activist narrative which has made its way into certain activist publications and therefore the mainstream, and a lot of it comes from Twitter, in my opinion.
I agree. Yeah. And as you dig into the details, and part of that, you're not able to do when you only have some of these mainstream sources talking about it. But then if you're somebody that's actually been there on the scene covering it, or you've seen these things in person, you look at the details and it just doesn't add up. It's like, okay, well, nobody there was actively making any comments of that regard of, white supremacy or white nationalism, things like that. With Kenosha, it really made no sense because one of the victims was white. So I don't understand how that would be a white supremacy shooting if it's a white person.
All the victims were white.
Or was it all? Yeah.
All three. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't want to make assumptions. I actually was going to say that, but didn't want to assume. So yeah. So it didn't make sense. It was like you're putting out that narrative on it when it really the actual facts of how it transpired didn't really add up to that. And then when confronted on what are the details, because of if that was the case, but then we looked on his Facebook page and here's a whole bunch of posts that are all pro-white or Nazi or whatever you want to call it, then you'd still be like, okay, influenced maybe the events of that night, but then they don't even have evidence of that. It's
not the case. It's among those people who had guns in Kenosha, from what I studied, Rittenhouse is clearly a back the blue fanboy. He's a police fanboy. He's a Trump fan. There were other militia that were libertarian, is what I noticed, and this gets into a little bit of the Boogaloo hybrid, where even the Boogaloo itself, I have been saying far right is a misnomer because a lot of different elements come together from the libertarian left and libertarian right. Or not, I don't want to, disparage libertarians, but it's an anarcho version of libertarianism, anarcho-libertarian left and right that come together in the Boogaloo. And some of those guys who were at Kenosha were like, well, if you fuck with the police, there's this one clip where they're like, then we're with you. All lives can't matter till Black Lives Matter. Let's go. And the libertarian militia that was at the gas station rolls out in support of Black Lives Matter, but they're also trying to protect property, and that's what puts them at odds with the crowd.
Which it goes into what you've been saying kind of throughout is with so many of these things, it's more complex than a simple explanation of, it was white supremacy. It was Black Lives Matter that did this. Like, the actual truths are that it's far more complex. Like you said, you have these groups, you see a bunch of people, most of them white, standing with guns and just assume, it's just a right-wing militia. And then you dig into it and it's like, no, but some of these people are Boogaloos. Some of these people, I actually had recently just rewatched some of my footage from Kenosha. And yeah, like there were these people that were clearly not far right, weren't actively like marching with the crowd, weren't actively like that pro Black Lives Matter, but also really didn't sound off against what people were saying. They weren't pushing back against any of the anti-police rhetoric, any of the, all lives can't matter till Black Lives Matter rhetoric. Like they were good on that, it seemed. It was just the property and the protection of the individual businesses and homes and things like that. So yeah, the answer is a lot more complicated. It's that you have those groups. Boogaloo, I also had gotten to see some more of them just before inauguration because they had their Lansing demonstration followed by showing up in Richmond. And yeah, and there I was able to actually have, because there were a lot fewer that showed up and it wasn't like a really tense protest, it was not anything with clashes or anything. So I was able to actually talk with some of these people. And you get the sense that it's, like you said, more I think the reason why you might mention libertarian with it is that a big part of their movement is anti-government. It's like wanting less government intervention, less government overreach, which is in line with libertarian ideals, to have more reduced government overreach, regulations, things like that. And then you combine that with anti-police, most definitely. There's a lot of that rhetoric in there, and just sort of like anti-state, which then starts to merge into more the anarcho, like you said, to where it's just like actually these systems in general, these institutions, it's not just that we want to get rid of the Democrats and put in the Republicans or vice versa. It's that the system as a whole, they have issue with, and then would like to see that. And then there's also the elements of it with the impending civil war. I know that's also a portion of it. The feeling that at some point society could break down altogether, and that it will come to this more street melee, people taking up arms, people defending their property sort of situation. So I think all of that fits into it and makes it a lot harder to count. And so when I see those labels of just, the Boogaloo, a far right movement or a far right militia, it's just this grossly oversimplified and in many cases false. Because like the ones I spoke with in Lansing, I can't speak for everybody in the movement, and they don't have exact numbers on membership and whatnot. I'm sure a lot of people would not even openly claim membership if they were, but and so there may be some that are far right, but like the ones I spoke with in Lansing, they had Black Lives Matter patches on. It wasn't even, they would stand with Black Lives Matter if confronted about it. It was, they came out with a patch that said Black Lives Matter. So it's a much more complex truth there, and it's much more in depth than a lot of people, or I guess maybe just don't give it time for. I guess maybe the media wants it to be a simple one-liner, a simple far right movement, far right militia, something easy, as opposed to going in depth on what are the actual intricacies of this.
Get this. There was a group that was charged with trying to sell weapons to Hamas. Did you ever see that headline?
Boogaloo, yeah. That came out in October, I believe, or so, somewhere around there. Yeah.
So when I interviewed Enrique Tarrio of the Proud Boys, he said, well, that doesn't seem very far right if you're working with Hamas. And I will extrapolate a little bit on that group because it's a real fascinating line of connections. But also, Tarrio told me that some of his guys got into it in Michigan, I think, with Boogaloo, that there was some tension between some Boogaloo guys and some Proud Boys, which he told me is something that occurred in the upper Midwest at one point. And he didn't really know. His words to me were, I don't really know what the fuck that is, to be honest. So this idea that everything is just grouped together doesn't hold water. Now, I mentioned the guy from Carolina. He had come up to Minneapolis, and there were a lot of Boogaloo who showed up during the George Floyd protests and the subsequent riots on the 28th. One of them, named Ivan Harrison Hunter, was charged for firing his long gun, an AK-47, at the 3rd Precinct. And it was documented that he yelled out justice for George Floyd. I went to his Facebook before it was taken down. I have a screenshot of this that's at my website, publicreport.org. And when you scroll about halfway down, you get to the section on the Boogaloo. His Facebook banner was a libertarian Black Panther flag, and it had a Black Panther on the yellow background where you usually see "Don't Tread on Me," and the snake was wrapped around the arm of the Black Panther, and they were both moving together, and it said, "Don't kneel on us." So, you get these just subcultural blending and hybrid, cross-pollination, that if you just are saying, oh, that's far right because that person has a gun, or that's, you're missing a lot of the nuance to what something like the Boogaloo, which is the subcultural internet meme-ified movement, how it springs up and how it brings people in that are of different, diverse schools of thought, Now, an interesting thing is that guy that I talked about, Hunter, in the Justice Department complaints and so forth, the charges, it's documented that he was texting with Stephen Carrillo. Stephen Carrillo from the Bay Area was charged with killing 2 officers. Did you guys get that story out your way?
Was that the one that happened in Las Vegas, or is that something different?
It's something different. Well, Las Vegas, there were some Boogaloo who were arrested, but who never, I don't think, ever fired at anybody. I remember those arrests in Las Vegas, but and there was also a New Mexico one. But Carrillo, and this is what's so interesting because, you, me, and then guys from other parts, from the DC guys, who've been out there covering, if we put all our notes together, what you start to find out, I've always said, is this is about a dozen or more local stories that are all different in their own way. And that's what makes it so hard to address on a national level by these institutions in New York City trying to figure it out. They don't see that it's so much more complicated. And we, you get these weird subcultural connections. As I said, Harrison, who had the "Don't Kneel on Us" flag as his Facebook banner, he was wired money from Stephen Carrillo. Stephen Carrillo actually shot and killed 2 officers. And for a long
in California,
that was in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. First in Oakland, he went in underneath the George Floyd protest, not necessarily in support, but to cause chaos. And so he took on this chaos agent role as a Boogaloo. And because that happened, that a lot of that was at the end of May. And then when he lived in Santa Cruz County, and when the county sheriffs came, he shot a deputy and killed a deputy. And
when they came to try to arrest him.
Okay. And he scrawled Boog, B-O-O-G, in his own blood. So, that if that's the first story that gets out, I got to ask, if I interview these Boogaloo guys again, why not change your name to something else? It seems that something happened early on that defamed everything. Not to mention that there is controversy even where the name comes from. It's a riff on a meme for an 80s movie and all this other stuff. But without getting into all that, you have something like that happening at the end of May. In the national press, they absorb that incident and start, I think, looking at the Boogaloo through that lens of cop killers and as being far right. Because I eventually, though I didn't find out until last week, Carrillo was libertarian right. I found a meetup.com profile which listed all of his political interests, and the Tea Party was included. So, but he had more of a personal breakdown in the media, and the local media in the San Francisco Bay Area. He was an active Air Force sergeant, and the local media had sort of traced his personal history and tragedy that had been in his life that led up to that moment. And so again, with all of these stories, they can't be painted with this broad brush, because they're certainly, what we're seeing are these autonomous populist movements, whether it's, the Proud Boys is the closest thing to an actual club or organization that tries to vet its members. But if you're Black Lives Matter, even, that's not those, there's only a handful of actually authorized chapters. Everything else is just autonomous in the spirit of what is going on with that local scene. That could be the same with anti-fascists, anarchists, and Boogaloo. It's all these local scenes is it's fascinating, and that's why we have 2-hour conversations about it.
And have no issue with nonstop material throughout. Yeah. Well, and that's a big part of why I made it a point to not just hunker down in one city and cover that nonstop, although there's a lot of value in that, to be able to follow the trajectory and story of one city, but to be able to see how it goes on in these different communities, because then it offers that perspective of, like you said, that you come to find that it's not like, oh, there was a national organizer, and whether I'm in Kenosha or whether I'm in Lansing or whether I'm in Portland or Seattle, it's all pretty much the same structure, pretty much the same, way of things going. It can be night and day from one of those to the next. And, there's that's sort of the thing that's harder to quantify and harder to easily share with people, because you need a more longer form either conversation like this or longer form of people looking through a lot of material, looking through videos from this city and this, from this date and this date, all of that.
What keeps you going at this point? I mean, certainly you must have seen something. All right, right. Before I ask this question, before 2020, were you shooting in 2019 any sort of protests and stuff? Was there?
Yeah.
Okay, so you've been at it. When did you start? What was your first?
Well, I began back in late 2015, early 2016 with the presidential primaries. So that was for like the Republican primary, Democrat primary there. And I was covering like Bernie Sanders rally, Trump rally, John Kasich rallies, all of those things. That over time then evolved into the protests pretty much right from Trump's election onward. Because I remember even literally that first week, November 10th or so it was, like that weekend that Trump was election, there was a Black Lives Matter protest in New York City that had marched to Trump Tower. Huge demonstration. So I remember covering that. But at the time, I wasn't as savvy with like tweeting out the videos or sort of how to work that on social media. I was using a lot of like personal social media pages to share it. Still in the more like reporting, like, hey, I'm going to different events, want to show people what's going on, but not as strategizing about how to get it out to a broader public. That really didn't start until around the Lansing protests in April 2020, where I came to find that Twitter was a really good platform for getting that out. So that's why like my YouTube channel even has older videos. I covered like NASA events, rocket launches, had gone to St. Louis, like when they won the Stanley Cup. So just kind of a potpourri of events. And then really come 2020, just with the frequency of everything, it became this pretty much every single day affair of going out to these protests, covering them, and then finding ones around the country as well.
And you've gotten swept up a couple times. In it doesn't help that, you know, when you go to these things, you have black bloc press, and I don't know if people understand that. But there's people who are dressed head to toe, and you're trying to blend in with them, but they have press on their helmets and stuff, which sort of throws in a monkey wrench for people like you and me who aren't participatory press, but we're trying to be, you know, fly on the wall press, more so to speak.
Right.
And I know you've gotten swept up before. How do you keep going after something like that? Anything that you care to mention about certain circumstances in which you've gotten, you know?
Well, I will say this: every single time I've gotten swept up, I am telling them, this being the police from the get-go, I'm press, and they just kind of like refuse to believe it or refuse to acknowledge it. And then once it makes its way a couple weeks or later, I present them with an insurmountable amount of evidence that I am press, and then it goes away. But it's ridiculous that it's happening. I will say that there aren't very many things that really agitate me other than seeing just the frequent attacks on the press. And it's not just me. I've seen it happen with many others. Not the black bloc. I'm not even referring to like the black bloc press per se, like actual, or, you know, people that are just there more fly in the wall press, getting shot with rubber bullets and stuff unnecessary. And I'm like, these people are just standing there, like actually just standing there. And ditto for me. Forgive me, there was an alarm that went off. And yeah, it seems almost like in some circumstances, it's like, oh, there's an easy target because it's somebody that's not going to resist, somebody that's not going to fight back much, which, I mean, generally speaking, is true. I'm not going to start getting into all that as I'm here as press covering a protest. So it is difficult. It is really difficult. And I would say the biggest thing that pushes me through for those nights and those moments is the support of fans and people. Because the other thing that people don't realize when this happens, when you get swept up and arrested in these instances, your phone is taken and it's taken into custody. Sometimes you never get those back. And so if you've been documenting things on your phone, video, whatever and whatnot, that's all now been taken too. So it's not just, oh, I physically have been removed and taken into custody. It's now all of my work, the communications side of it, the phone and whatnot, but also the actual material is all now being taken into custody, and it's locked and whatnot. So I'm not necessarily concerned about the that aspect of it, but you don't have access to it. And so then if you were otherwise going to license videos to somebody, now you can't, because you don't have the files to send them. You can't get any of it out. And so it hurts you in the moment, and it hurts you in the days that follow, because now you don't have access to that material to get out. Generally speaking, by the time you get the phone back, if you even do, it's no longer breaking news, and people aren't as interested in licensing the footage.
So you take a financial loss for the money you put forward on that trip that
every
you
time.
invested. Yeah.
Which and that's where I say, like, it's the support from the fans, not even just monetary, although that definitely helps, but just even like people that chime in and say, Brendan, like, I'm so sorry this happened to you, or yeah, I'm here with you. Thank you for what you do, things like that. Because like on those nights, it's like, man, police aren't taking me seriously, and I can't even really conduct my work because I cannot licensing the videos out because they've taken my phone. So if I'm able to hop on some other device or on the laptop or something and see, positive remarks from people and support, it definitely helps. It really does, because those nights are just so challenging mentally and physically that you got to have something to kind of push you through that.
I remember I tweeted, even before we had met, I had Wauwatosa, like I had tweeted, somebody else took video of that, of what happened there. And I had said, this guy's the best in the game. He's everywhere. We need eyes on the ground like Brendan, because, so when you get treated like you're part of the scene and participating, it's certainly where a lot of us, I think, are, we need you out there. You're going to keep going, I'm assuming, with stuff. This, it's calmed down a little bit, maybe. What's your general feeling about how stuff?
Yeah, it's definitely calmed down. It certainly hasn't flatlined. I think a lot of people wanted to think it would flatline. I knew it wouldn't. It's one of those things where these groups have been organizing for so long. It wasn't contingent on Trump being president or not being president. It's a continuous movement, irregardless of who's in the White House. So yeah, I mean, I do see it now as more of a lull in the action. Still be things popping up in the Pacific Northwest, probably. DC tends to organize quite a bit. Some of the bigger cities like New York as well. More of the peripheral, either smaller cities or ones that didn't have as big a protest, probably not as much until maybe spring or summer, I would guess. And all this is just speculation, but that's sort of where I view things right now. It's quieter, also because it's winter, so it's not really very conducive for people being outside. As I'm saying this right now, I can see that it's snowing outside and it's bitter cold across the country, so that doesn't really make it easy for people to come out en masse. You'll have a couple, people that are always out there regardless of the weather, regardless of the circumstance, and then others that they call it like the fair weather protesters, but like it really is for some of them, like literally only if it's fair weather, and then you have bigger numbers there. So I think we'll probably be seeing more in spring or summer, and definitely be monitoring.
May 1st is usually for in California, being in LA, that's when there is an annual protest among the work. It's the Workers' Day, May 1st. And so,
okay, like a May Day protest.
May Day, yeah. So a lot of the video that you see of Black Bloc in Seattle and Portland of rioting pre-2020 is on May Day protests.
Okay.
So we're late enough in the broadcast right now. I don't feel bad mentioning. Usually, I don't like to advertise sort of leftist. When I say leftist, I'm of the left. Actually, I was born. My parents went to UC Berkeley. Like, leftist is a specific term that's used on Twitter, especially to refer to those who have diverse beliefs, whether it's anarchist, communist even, and a wide range of different anti-fascist affiliations. So when I use the term leftist, it's very specific to what that is culturally. I got to let you go. I'm going to try to go back and answer some of these questions. We didn't get to a lot of them, and I apologize for everybody. It's just we've had so much to talk about. Oh, there's one last thing here. How has cancel culture affected you? Have people? I know that people have tried to go after me, but in a certain respect, if you maintain your neutrality as much as you can and continue with what you do, there seems to be people seem to be just as interested in what you capture eventually when they realize that you're the eyes on the ground. That's what I've come to notice. A lot of people follow you that maybe tried to cancel you. Is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been a remarkable thing to witness, is that, like, especially late summer and into the fall, there were a lot of people that wanted to block me or post nasty things about me. And then all of a sudden a couple months pass by and these same people unblock me and follow. And all of a sudden I see them retweeting the videos, posting videos. And it's crazy because, like, all these assumptions were made about me. I didn't comment on most of it because it's just like, I'm not engaging with that. I'm not engaging with internet rumors. And it has been fascinating to watch. Like, not everybody, obviously there's some that were mad then, still mad now for whatever reason. But there has been a good chunk of people that initially were trying cancel, or, kind of hopped on that bandwagon of, yeah, cancel this, block this dude, block this. And then as they saw just endless circulation of videos in so many forms, whether it was Proud Boys in Salem, DC Capitol, I mean, you name it, then they came back around and then are no longer trying to cancel. So it's interesting. I don't know how that trajectory works long term, if it is just kind of like back and forth with people, or if this is a sign of more stabilization with less of that I saw early on. Remains to be seen, but yeah, it has been fascinating to watch.
Yeah. So I just want to give a shout out to this guy. This is Dennis of T4Y podcast, Fairweather Twitter Trolls. LOL. I did his podcast last week. What I'm finding, which is so exciting, is that you can connect with other podcasts, other people that are having these conversations that want the more nuanced story to be told. And thank you for being here with us today, because giving us your time, because you, just like those Fairweather Twitter trolls, as was said, I'm sure that at some point they realized it's better to have eyes on the scene than to be in the dark and not know what is going on. So you have provided a fantastic set of eyes on the ground for us all to see your work. It was inspirational to me early on. So I'm sure you got to go, and I'll let you go, and I'm going to stay on. And that's BG on the scene, everybody. Follow him on Twitter. Thanks, Brendan Gutenschwager, for being on with us
Thank you
today.
so much. I appreciate it. And just before I go, I want to say thank you for, the long form conversation, to be able to dive more deeply into these topics, because that is something that I believe people deserve, to be able to know, not just quick little one line here, two lines here, to have this in-depth conversation. And it sounds like you've been collaborating with a lot of other podcasters too, to try to get that. So thank you for that. Just wanted to put that out there.
All right. Well, we'll talk again soon, I'm sure. And thanks again for being with us.
Thank you.
Appreciate All right. Take it easy. All right, I'm going to stay on and try to answer some of these questions. I was, when someone like Brendan and I that was 2 hours of us talking, and still, it's like there's so many other topics. You know what I didn't even bring up? This is why we're going to have to talk again. Is I was about to talk about December the 5th, and then I go on these side turns, and I didn't get back to it. But on December the 5th, and as somebody from the upper Midwest, I would have loved to have asked him about this. December the 5th, although I think I did talk to him about it on a private conversation with him, that was the date that the headlines were dominated by a CNN interview with the Secretary of State of Michigan, in which it said armed protesters, dozens of armed protesters showed up or descended on the home of the Michigan Secretary of State. It was a headline that was not true. I took the video from the live stream, I lightened it. And this is again why if you're in a newsroom in New York City, you have to have somebody in your newsroom who is from the right, who understands to look at video and say, okay, none of these protesters are wearing flak jackets. I don't see a long gun. I don't see anybody brandishing or with a sidearm or anything. If you can't look at the video, all it took me a couple of minutes of ripping the live stream, and it was night. So, you couldn't see whether the people had guns or not, but you can then, it's like putting on an Instagram filter. I upped the brightness. I played with the levels using a color correction filter, and I saw there was nobody who had a gun at that December the 5th right-wing protest in front of Michigan Secretary of State's home. Now, it's another issue as to whether people should be protesting on the right or the left, because the left showed up at Josh Hawley's home before January the 6th to put pressure on him and ultimately decry that he and Donald Trump were in support of a quote unquote wild protest. So we could look back on that one and say who was right there. I'd probably say the protesters. But I'm going to get to some of these questions. But the point is the story that I broke was that CNN had run with dozens of armed protesters. Well, when CNN does it, then it gets what we call in the media pickups. Other stories do stories on that story without verifying whether or not the protesters were armed. The Detroit Police Department, and I'm going to have to bring this up to Brendan first thing when we talk again. Detroit Police Department tells me, we saw no weapons, anything like that. The Michigan State Police told me that they did not see any weapons of any kind. And the protesters I spoke with, more than one, said they saw nobody open carrying. Now, it is a concealed carry state, but as far as they knew, nobody was concealed carrying either. That is what dominated the national headlines, a story of make-believe armed right-wing protesters on December the 5th. Meanwhile, I'm in Black Bloc watching these two groups that I referred to, Antifa Sacramento and Berkeley Antifa, attack not only Proud Boys and right-wing Trump supporters at the Sacramento Capitol, but they attacked a couple. And I have that up. If you go to publicreport.org, in my final report, I mentioned the incident in which a guy walks away with a club where I saw them curb jump a young couple that one of them had a Trump hat on. And so that's the big difference. The Black Bloc will go after and call anybody a Nazi and beat them just if they are a Trump supporter. We noticed that on November the 14th in DC, December the 5th in Sacramento, and also I noticed that on October the 17th in San Francisco. I was going to say December the 12th was more consensual back and forth. The Proud Boys were definitely on the move on December the 12th in Washington, D.C. That was a different situation. But what did the press write about? They wrote about armed protesters. It's interesting to see here that Brendan said it's almost expected, or it's quite usual for protests in the upper Midwest to have guns. Therefore, maybe I understand a little bit about how it was assumed. But, we shouldn't have national headlines in which major media outlets like Rolling Stone, Vanity Fair, the BBC also picked it up. Every single other, major network jumped on as of right now, the only media network that has corrected themselves is the conservative National Review. If you Google National Review, Secretary of State, Michigan, it comes up. The headline is "Police Say No Weapons Found at the Right-Wing Protest." But that's all that the press could write about that evening, and nothing was given to the Antifa groups that were on the attack. I'm going to go back and try to check out. Sorry again that we couldn't get Brendan to answer some of these. I'm going to go way back. Boy, there's a lot. And I'm really sorry about this I would have liked to have been able to. What kind of maniac chases a dude with a rifle who just shot somebody? That blew my mind. We're talking about Kenosha back here. There's a couple of other things that I would like to point out about Kenosha. The mob was going after him with a rifle. It was a mob chase of Rittenhouse. So when you say, well, who would do that? Well, when you're in the group, things, as I have witnessed, get out of hand. Another interesting thing I didn't get a chance to tell Brendan was, I don't know if he realizes that the first shot from Rittenhouse actually misses. And it misses a middle-aged black man who is not in black bloc. He's wearing jeans. He has a white pedestrian, regular-ass COVID mask on. And the first shot misses him by a couple inches. So as we also say, well, what kind of people go out, chase someone with a gun? The other side of it is that, he was Rittenhouse fired off that first shot in the second after he tripped, and he almost hit a black man in the head. Somebody said, well, what does it matter what color he was, and so forth? Given the heightened racial tensions, we were so much close to even more disaster that evening had that man been shot, among others, So as much as I've been desensitized, I guess, Brendan's been around guns a lot more than I have, being somebody who's from Northern California and lives in Los Angeles. But I will say that it's dangerous nonetheless in a situation like that, where people were just hanging out into the wee hours of the night, waiting for something to happen until something did. You can look at the last episode where I talked to Richie McGinnis about Kenosha. I play a couple of videos in that episode as well, including Brendan's video, which I break down a little more in detail. Oh boy. I know that we didn't did I hear, let's see. We didn't get to all these questions. I apologize again. What kind of language were people using? Did you get the sense that people were there to kill or harm others? Congress, police, or anyone else? I assume, okay, so this is about Washington, D.C. The question is, what kind of language were people using? What kind of rhetoric at the Capitol? We did hear, or at least I heard the famous Alex Jones line, 1776 will rise again. There was a lot of revolutionary rhetoric. Whose house? Our house. We're taking it, there was this atmosphere of revolutionary play, as it were. Of course, 1776 rise again is from the Alex Jones interview on CNN with Pierce Morgan, where he talked about, don't try to come and take our guns. That was sort of this moment on cable news that put Alex Jones on the map. So it was interesting to hear that phrase, 1776 will rise again, which you would see 1776 sort of printed on t-shirts and stuff like that. But did you get the sense that anybody was there to kill or harm? I did not. I should bring that question up to Brendan and others. My sense was that people were part of an autonomous riot action, and that doesn't necessarily mean kill people. So that's my answer to that question. I'm going to back up. Somebody mentioned the Keck flag. The Keck flag is a weird green flag. This is when we was talking about 4chan types. 4chan types were flying the Keck flag, I saw. We did see a Keck flag. Now, a friend of mine who was in the media back in Philly saw a Keck flag, and she said they had a green KKK flag. Well, it's not actually a green KKK flag, even though it says Keck on it. And it's this weird green flag with a circle of, it says KEK. The Kekistan thing is a 4chan kind of mythical country called Kekistan, where they worship the frog god. Now, the frog god in Egyptian lore is actually named Kek. And they figured this out, and they figured out that Pepe the Frog was the alt-right motto. So they made a mythical Kekistan, kind of a joke, but kind of this just bizarre subcultural thing. So the Kek flag is not the KKK flag. I had to explain to my friend who's a reporter in Philadelphia. And it's this weird underground alt-right thing that's a kind of a joke because of some weird frog god in Egyptian mythology. So that's what the Kek flag is. And of course, can a white supremacist be raising it? Sure, it's possible, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the person is a white supremacist, though I think alt-right is a fair characterization, just like I think alt-right is a fair characterization of the America First flag, the Groyper's flag, being a nationalist thing. So all this stuff is incredibly sort of subcultural. Oh, wait, sorry, that's the wrong one. Well, actually, I'll bring it up. Let's see what this one says. This is a response. The thing is that anyone can fly any flag for optics reasons. For all we know, it was a black bloc guy flying the Kek flag for disinfo. Can't believe anything anymore. Well, that's certainly true. You don't know who it was who was flying the flag, and if it was being wielded by a card-carrying alt-right member. You don't know if it was a troll. But at the same time, I'm not surprised that there was a Kek flag at a populist rally, or an America First flag, which is the alt-right kid brother group. So I don't know what to make of it all. I will say this, though, you can't judge the whole group. The common point that all of these guests that I had in the last week, Ford, Richie, and Brendan, is that the group does come to critical mass at some point. So whereas even back in that first week of September, if you scroll through Brendan's video, he said he was suspicious of how quickly the Molotov cocktails were thrown on the 100 night anniversary in Portland. Now I said, I'm not surprised, because the digital flyers said, "Be water, spread fire." So whereas you can suspect that one person might wield undue influence and attention, certainly the media seems to fixate on the flashiest. The group there, from what I have seen, for the most part, has been there to do what they said that they were there to do. In regards to that other question about, were people there to hurt people or necessarily take hostages, I think you'd be hard pressed to make the argument that that was the overall feeling, was let's hurt people and take hostages. But at the spearhead, you probably have the most militant who are carrying, zip ties. I think it was at least two people who were, and so forth. So let's look at some of these other questions. See if I can catch up. I see a lot of comments. I'll try to look at the ones with just with actual question marks. What was this is from the T4Y podcast as well. He wanted to ask BG this, and I apologize. What was the overwhelming tone of the crowd? I just addressed that. Were they there to cause people harm or property? Well, I think that the in all of these riots, the people are there to cause property damage. That goes for the left. That goes to obviously Kenosha. That was 3 nights where cars were burned in a row. So I think the overall characterization and tone of riotous out of all these activated cities has been the same. And that includes the capital, that it was riotous in its characterization of 1776 will rise again. Did you hear the race narratives? I'm sorry again that I wasn't able to ask Brendan, but I think we covered that. We covered the white supremacy narrative, how quickly activist Twitter is able to get that going. Because what happens is activist Twitter gets it going. The tabloids jump on it. And then the television stations see it printed in the tabloids and say, well, it's legitimate. Well, the Daily Mail said it, or, Vox said it, or whoever, and we'll just go from there. The Huffington Post ran with it. So, what else do we have here? And again, you guys, I'm sorry. Any other questions that we could get to? There's a couple of diversity of tactics. I didn't explain that, what diversity of tactics is. Diversity of tactics is, of course, the leftist mantra that we do not police the protest is their point of view. That means you can beat somebody up as part of the protest. You can burn a building down. And as part of diversity of tactics, the leftist protest movement says we do not police that. And that is something that I fundamentally disagree with. And that as I get more people from the left coming on, I will challenge them in regards to diversity of tactics. Someone asked BG, why don't you stream and only post clips? We addressed that one as well. I popped that in. If you live stream, you can be caught. And I tried to live stream in Tacoma, Washington on the 24th. That was a very aggressive crowd. I quickly killed my live stream. Most of my live stream's terrible from that day because I held it by my my hip so nobody could see it. But you don't want to get caught, and you don't want to get the mob against you. Let's see. I hear some people talking about this is just a soft launch this last week. Don't have you won't see a lot of people, but only a couple hundred people will see this sort of first iteration. It gets played also on Twitter. We're simultaneously, please subscribe, by the way. If you are here on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/unblockedlive, please click the subscribe button. We're also on Facebook there's a new Unblocked Live Facebook page. That's facebook.com/unblockedlive. Also publicreport.org, which is part of publicreport.org. Facebook.com/publicreport.org. So please subscribe, follow me on Twitter. That's my handle because I would like to grow an audience. I'm going to be doing this regularly, Mondays and Wednesdays. Mondays and Wednesdays, 12 o'clock noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern time. And please subscribe, spread the word. I'm going to try to get, again, another shout out to T4Y Podcast. I see you mentioning the Boogaloo Boy interview you did. I would like to do that interview. Here, I'll show this comment. T4Y Podcast says, I interviewed Magnus of the Boogaloo Boys. They had people there at the gas station. They were the guys pulling back the Trump supporters from engaging the crowd that were advancing. I would like to look into that more. And I'm starting to, right about this time, the 2.5 hour mark is when my voice gets to get tired. So I'm going to say, what happened to BLM? I'm not sure what that is in reference to. Like, where did they go? Well, on January the 6th, if that's what we're talking about, they issued a message, and it was covered in local mainstream media in DC, that local BLM said for people not to go out that week of January the 6th. Now, you have leftist marches that are still going on, usually on Saturday nights in Washington, D.C. They used to harass diners. I went undercover with that group. They are a diverse group. You don't have any one group that's called Antifa DC. You used to, from what I am told, and that their Twitter account got canceled. Now, if you're more of a leftist from the DCC and you're willing to come at me if that information is disputed, but I do know that there are All Out DC is a major Antifa organizing group. Shutdown DC is the group with the orange beanies. They showed up in front of Josh Hawley's house in what I could tell was a peaceful protest. From what I saw, it's been in the news because Josh Hawley, after all, is actually going after one of the protesters that was heavily featured. Here, I'll show you a little bit of the Holly protest.
Let them infringe on our rights.
This is the
Every
Holly
ballot
protest in
that's been counted,
DC.
it is
It's a
over.
shutdown
So when
DC. You see
democracy
the
is
orange
under attack,
beanie there.
what do we do?
Now, interestingly enough, on January
When
5th and
democracy
January
is
6th,
under attack,
there were people
what
with
do we do?
orange beanies
What do
that
we
were
do?
actually in
We're not going to let these
um,
fascist, racist,
the right wing groups, and they did that as sort of an
has a
appropriation
vast mandate
to
on
confuse people,
coronavirus
basically, just like you saw Proud Boys on January the 5th and 6th that were in all black. It's sort of this, it's a tactic. So you even saw Proud Boys wearing orange beanies on January the 6th. But that's the trademark of Shutdown DC. And this is the Shutdown DC rally that's outside of Josh Hawley's home. For some reason, we're not getting video, audio right. Or maybe we are. Oh, you know what? I don't have my
about the
microphone.
American people. So when democracy is under attack, what do we do? What do we do? When democracy is under attack, what do we do? What do we do?
So I'm not sure how low if I had that low enough. I'll turn it down. So this fellow, apparently Josh Hawley's wife, has in the part of Virginia where they live, it is illegal to have protests in front of residences. So they're using local ordinances to go after this group. Now, this protest does not look any different than the December 5th protest, I've remarked, outside of the Michigan Secretary of State. Also, both protests were unarmed. Both protests had megaphones. Both of them were loud. That's just the nature of them. But this group was protesting in front of Hawley's home. That woman that you see there in a different video criticizes Hawley for encouraging a wild protest. This is, of course, the week before January the 6th, where she makes that remark. Thank you for the comments, y'all. There's always room for part 2. I hope so. Any other comments that we see here? Headline trending on Twitter: impeachment trial. House managers are revealing new footage of the Capitol riot. I did see that headline currently that they were going to reveal new footage. The trick with this stuff is that it can be cherry picked. Editing, you can manipulate a lot. When my video was stolen by Twitter and it was edited, my live stream from the Capitol was edited into a highlight reel with Bullhorn Lady yelling. It made them look a lot more coordinated than they really were. It made Bullhorn Lady look like she was commanding it. But only one person, from what I could tell, actually listened to her. So that's thoughts on if the press can be fair and balanced. What's the future for traditional press? I think we need to encourage press to be as fair and balanced as possible. And in order to do that, they need to slow down and not be concerned about making that web money and jumping on the trends. In some ways, the only hope for the mainstream media is to pave their own way, in my estimation. They cannot be beholden to Twitter trends, to tabloid trends, and activist narratives that are trending on both of those. Instead, for us to be impartial, you have to get out there and invest in having people like Brendan, like myself. Now, I wouldn't do it myself because but there are younger people who are cut of the same cloth. Now, I don't know if any of them would have Brendan's a real, special kind of independent journalist. I don't know if any of them could go out there and do what he does, but some certainly could. And if you're the mainstream media, you want people like that. You need boots on the ground, and you need to start doing journalism again, where you're sending your guy out there and you're getting information from the ground, not just taking it from activist recuts and sizzle reels. I'm sure what we're going to get out of the impeachment trial are sizzle reels. Sizzle reel is a term we use in good old Hollywood, where we put together an actor's reel. Some of you might know that I've been doing theater and journalism since I was a teenager. And you put together an actor sizzle reel. It's all the cuts of you, in a 1 minute looking good on camera. That's essentially what we're getting. Is we're getting these sizzle reels from activists, and that's controlling the narrative. And mainstream media outlets need to send their guys out there and slow down, get that material back from their boots on the ground instead of stealing it from people like me and then cutting it into a highlight reel. And there will be more reckoning with CNN and so forth. Did you observe Alex Jones on a bullhorn? I observed Alex Jones on December the 12th. That was Million MAGA March 2. He was on a bullhorn then. I know he was on January the 6th. I would say Alex Jones's role is going to be looked at a lot because rhetorically, people had his motto, 1776 will rise again. That was his motto. He famously, told Piers Morgan. But we had seen Alex Jones very active on the bullhorn. I saw him on December the 12th in the evening before the Proud Boys marched on Black Lives Matter Plaza, right after a stabbing in which several Proud Boys were stabbed by somebody who was in all black. Somebody who was alone near Harry's Bar had gotten into it with Proud Boys. And I can't say for sure who started it, but it was Proud Boys versus a guy in black bloc. Several Proud Boys were stabbed. That was on December the 12th. Afterwards, the Proud Boys led a march from Harry's Bar. If you scroll down my Twitter all the way back to December 12th, I actually think I live streamed that. And then they stopped at the Marriott where more Trump supporters came out, and Alex Jones was on a bullhorn then. So he's been around and he's been very active in these DC actions as a sort of cultural figurehead, as it were. Well, I hope the press can be fair and balanced. I hope that the work that we do, myself talking to guys like Brendan, if you haven't watched Richie McGinnis, that was the episode from Monday. Episode 12 was on Monday. Richie McGinnis is the head of the Daily Caller. And although you might think, oh, well, that's conservative, the approach of the Daily Caller team was to do exactly what I just described to you, which was to send a bunch of young people out and get the material firsthand for, yourself. And then the caller would license that material out to other networks and so forth. But the networks should be doing it. They should be out there figuring out the story for themselves. That is our only hope, is that we have more actual journalist boots on the ground and not quarantine journalists writing from the comfort of their own home based on sizzle reels that they get for Twitter. I'm going to leave it at that. Well, I'm going to play some outro music because I'm so proud of myself for getting it. Last call for questions. If anybody has anything else to say, I will, and I didn't get to, I will take a look at it at the end. This is the last call for that. I want to just play my outro here. This is very exciting and official, guys. This has been the Unblocked podcast live Mondays and Wednesdays at 12 noon Pacific. I'm Jeremy Lee Quinn coming to you live from California. I won't say exactly where, an undisclosed location, shall we say. Please subscribe on YouTube, youtube.com/unblockedlive, facebook.com/unblockedlive, at JLeeQuinn Quinn on Twitter. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll have new guests next week. For Brendan Gutenschwager, I'm Jeremy Lee Quinn signing off.